Hello everybody, and welcome back to today's second attempt at reviewing an entire franchise. We return to the land of Nintendo and the first lady of video games, Samus Aran. While not having gone on the 100 Adventures of Link, has through her reappearances had quite a bit of a career, a few even unknown to her more hardcore fans, as they call themselves. The central idea of Metroid becoming Metroidvania before Konami finally got off their roots and joined Samus in that genre after Bloodlines or whatever game was the first legitimate Metroidvania Castlevania, the series was a brilliant reinvention for even at the time must have seemed like a humdrum 2D platformer genre even in those NES days. The central idea was fairly similar to another early pioneer, Mega Man, where it's a platformer shooter, but instead of the simpler idea of acquiring your power-ups by running a level and shooting an important-looking guy in the face, you still did that, but sometimes additional power-ups would be hiding behind invisible blocks, puzzles, or obstacles defeated by previous power-ups. It worked fantastically by putting multiple spins on a classic formula and really bent the platformer genre into an exploration shape. With the addition of further upgrades that would become iconic to the series, such as the grapple beam and screw attack, along with multiple different guns to collect, that would eventually fill the screen with shoot-em-up looking rows of death, the exploration of the zones allowing for finding interesting abilities, that would allow further exploration in a variety of convoluted fashions, that would form Metroid into its own standout brand for the platformer-loving world. Even next to Castlevania, Metroid, while still using the same explorative framework, would have its own unique feel due to the settings of the universe, the scope of the power-ups being collected, the monsters fought, and through additional characters being added. Something to make Samus the badass of the galaxy that we know her as today. This iconography of gameplay would lead to the best and the worst that the bounty hunter can offer the universe, and today we're going to be looking at her entire resume. So sit back, relax, and enjoy another hour or so of premier space bounty action. To be fair, I never actually played the original Metroid for this series. I had a hand with the original Mario back around the time of its release, but never Metroid. It was always that game that did acquire a lot of notoriety for Nintendo to keep plugging away its sequels, but not as widely recepted as their plumber mascot. I decided to play Zero Mission for my Metroid review since over the 10 years since the original game, Nintendo had time to iterate on it and put up improvements, bring it up to modern specs, and actually add some further content to the original. Based on the Fusion engine being produced around the same time, it brought a new breath of life into the original game that could have only been matched by Super Metroid, and also bringing with the game the level of reverence that a remake of a pioneer video game truly required. While I can't confirm for myself from my research, it does seem like Zero Mission aimed to be a frame-by-frame remake of the original game, while adding some new stuff on top of it to make up for the game not being constrained by being the file size of a Marowak PNG. In Zero Mission, they added a couple new upgrades from the further titles, along with a couple new areas to explore, and probably a new boss fight or two to be shot in the face, since Metroid had to cope with having the original too. The plot for the game is told a bit better with the GBA's new ability to incorporate cutscenes, but remains largely the same. Pretty token stuff and derived from a NES booklet as things were back in those days. The story begins with the only gang in the universe named the Space Pirates managing to get their hands on a newly discovered species of something that were notable for their horrible ability to latch onto any organism and drain it of all of its life energy. Assuming that they can breed quickly, and with the evil hands that laid upon them, Federation Society decided that they had to do something about this. They learned where their base of operations was located, and they dispatched Samus Aran, a bounty hunter to planet Zebes, in order to track down the Metroids that the Space Pirates had acquired and destroy the facility by any means necessary. The rest of the game from that point on is a subterranean Metroidvania environment where Samus will have to retrain herself and acquire power-ups in order to face the dangers below and the space pirate lieutenants. Unfortunately from here, there are few plot points to be had, and the game relies on Metroid Fusion fueling gameplay with proper jumping physics and accurate shooting through a bunch of different environments such as giant vertical shafts, water features, and a lava room. A couple points through the game do get more emphasis, such as Mother Brain's awakening and the first reveal of the Metroids, gets a nice PG gory scene. It has a virtually the same control scheme as Fusion due to the engine shift, which is a damned good one since it provides a better feeling of control and slightly more agility to Samus's movements that livens up a game that had to deal with some jumping jank as per what the NES could actually accomplish. If nothing else, the game did hit that mark of being an enhanced remake of a classic. The boss battles have been improved, Ridley didn't receive much of an improvement and instead settles for a brilliant new design to bring him more in line with his modern visage, while also making him about 3 times bigger. He retains his same fireball-based battle plan rather than the tackle and tail stab patterns that we would start seeing later. Kraid was where the remake truly shines, since the original idea for Kraid wasn't able to be fully realized, where he was slightly shorter than Samus and only managed to throw hundreds of spikes all over his battlefield. Whereas in the remake, we get to have a lovely surprise when Nintendo revamped Kraid to be the giant monster that he was always meant to be. Able to fill an entire room and constantly launch projectiles at Samus while she attempts to blast his throat full of flaming missiles. There are a handful of newcomers such as a couple worm-based enemies and a flying meatball that you fight in a circular cave that can absolutely go fuck itself. Up until this point, the game remains largely the same, since most of the extra content was bookended to the end game. Defeat the 2 lieutenants, get yourself upgraded, and head down to the depths of the facility to activate the self-destruct and get your space boots back home. However, things begin getting climactic as you descend towards the final area. The path gets windier, the enemies start getting tougher, and there's this air of finality about the place, especially when you start coming upon these defense units that spit out energy donuts at you. As Samus descends, we also come face to face with the beings that started this whole mission. For being the namesake of the series, Metroids weren't seen until the very end of the game due to the necessity of the Ice Beam, the one thing that the original Metroids can be defeated by. Otherwise, your offensive options for the Space Devils are pretty limited. You'll have to deal with a big pile of them to get down to the core of the fortress, where you'll be finding an ugly sight. The room that contains the core reactor powering the fortress is heavily defended by shields flanked by those defense units from earlier, filling the screen with donut-patterned doom while Samus has to maneuver around as best she can, filling the shields full of missiles. However, Samus finally does break into the actual core and finds that it's actually the being Mother Brain, an intelligent creature whose brain power allows it to control the entire facility from the bottom to the top. Similar to the shields, Mother Brain shares their weakness. It's encased in a tough glass bottle and needs many missiles shot to pierce the defense and fill the space pirate leader with tons of warheads. Similar to the shields, there are plenty of defense units helping out Mother Brain, manage to jump around successfully for a good minute or so, and Mother Brain will be reduced to a puddle, and its death immediately activates the classic Metroid escape scene where Samus needs to jump up a gigantic shaft of random platforms in a short amount of time to avoid being exploded. With the mission complete, Samus flies off with a well-earned victory. Until the remake comes in and the space pirates randomly manage to knock out her thrusters and forces a crash landing back on Azebes. This crash does a lot worse to Samus as her power armor fails to reinitialize, and putting her in the only time in the franchise where she has to work with her iconic Zero suit. Basically a high-tech leotard. Thus begins the remake content. For whatever godforsaken reason, Nintendo decided to make a bunch of the remake content into a long and winding stealth section. For how out of left field it is, it's not a good level because Metroid isn't built for stealth games. In other stealth games, you usually get options and a map built for stealth that allows you multiple routes and hiding places to take out enemy patrols. But in Zero Mission, this is hard-coded scripting and not much else. The stealth isn't clever since there's only really one route to go. You just have to figure out the scripted events and do them on time. If you don't, then you get fucked over very quickly due to Samus's only option being a stun pistol, which only works temporarily on unaware guards. The one thing working in your favor is that in comparison to other non-stealth stealth sections, while it is long, there's also not a lot of guards, and some parts of the map are so simple that it looks like Ocarina-style stealth. They did add in something better with Samus being confronted by a test of her ancestors by having her fight a Chozo mural to prove her strength. It's actually a good boss and a nice addition to Samus' character arc by having the old Chozo call on her to prove her worthiness to reacquire her body armor, and use them to evacuate from Zebes. Probably not the best time, but I appreciate the nods to Samus' upbringing. With the curb-stomping abilities rediscovered, Samus gets to fly through the Space Pirate mothership, smashing everything in her path to the hangar, and get on an evacuation ship, only to be stopped by Ridley. Well, not really. Apparently, the Space Pirates, or Ridley himself, were banking on his eventual demise since they built a robot look-alike of him. A weird thing that some of the bosses in Zero Mission did is that they were made more difficult, so shooting their projectiles would health or missiles as recompense. Usually this didn't have much bearing on anything other than the boss fights were a bit longer, but here it's absolutely needed. Mecha Ridley is a tank of a boss and only being touchable through missile attacks, which obviously needs ammo. In order to get what you need, Mecha Ridley has its own missile attacks, which also drops missiles. This thing is a true beast and a testament to your mastery of the game, because it's the final boss if you're playing it legit. If you're not, then it's a nice reminder to quick save. Final bosses sometimes need to be marathons, but when your claws are hitting pretty regularly and for more than half an energy tank per, it'd be a good time to tweak their numbers, I guess. Mecha Ridley feels like something Capcom would do, but otherwise it's a worthwhile hard boss with too small of a hitbox. This could have been better, but I like the application of the Ridley brand and its place in the story as pretty much the last thing that the Space Pirates had to throw at the being that managed to kill every one of their agents on Zebes. With Ridley 2 of 2 in the ground, Samus steals the ship, escapes, and completes her original outing as a famous bounty hunter. This game is incredibly solid and a monument to the series that would become famous enough to spawn a dozen sequels, along with the remaking talent that Nintendo can put out when they put their mind to it. While this game feels pretty much like Fusion 1.5 since it's using its engine, its adherence to the original Metroid comes across, and it feels like the engine is being used to recreate a classic rather than using it as an excuse to just make another Metroid game. Everything the engine added to the original formula makes it stronger and easier to use for the new audience they gathered over the years. It really is a spearhead that proved that the GBA could manage now that console Metroid was moving in a new direction. Zero Mission is a fantastic way for anyone who didn't manage to play the original game to get an enhanced crack at it. It's a true reclamation of one of Nintendo's most important game releases, and I really do appreciate the time that I spent with it, even though in comparison to other Metroidvanias, it's kind of short and a bit deficient on content. If I didn't play the original Metroid, I sure as hell didn't get around to Metroid 2. This one had a bit of a controversy rolling along with it for a few years. This game originally came out for the Game Boy, the mono-colored one. Nintendo left the game by the wayside as they kept reinventing Metroid during the next couple console generations, and so, at some point, fans took it upon themselves to remake the game left behind. Nintendo was not happy about this and smashed every fan remake to dust in a highly news-covered fashion, leading to resentment and further jokes about how Nintendo treats their community badly. However, in a rare twist, Nintendo was legitimately remaking it and brought us Return of Samus in 2017, another remake of an important part of the series. While not as much of a classic due to the limited everything in Metroid 2, this one does have something that needs to be done. After the events in the original game and learning how dangerous Metroids are, the Federation charges Samus with a follow-up job at the research facility on SR-388, the place where Metroids were originally discovered. Samus is tasked with eradicating every sample of Metroids from the universe. This leads us into another subterranean expedition to shoot every Metroid in the Mushroom Head. Due to its origins, Return of Samus is much more of a reimagining than a remake, which seems to work in the game's favor since it introduces a more Metroidvania map design, with Samus's larger suite of upgrades to get around, multiple suits, and some more complicated puzzles. Along with more interesting gameplay ideas such as the ability to parry attacks massive damage, which is a decent replacement for the Ice Beam in some early Metroid hunts, Samus in the remake is incredibly agile and mobile. This Samus can get stuff done with her improved acrobatics such as shooting from ledge grab and free diagonal shots. The further accuracy to Samus's jumping is further appreciated. In the remake, the plot is as simple as it sounded. Kill 40 Metroids that were documented by the science team. To do this, samples have to be collected from downed Metroids that activate elevators to the further depths of the planet. The important points of Samus 2 is the expansion to the Metroid life cycle. While we do know Metroids in their jellyfish form, Samus 2 did a lot to expand on that and give us evolved Metroid designs that turned them into some sort of pseudo-Pokemon family containing Alpha, Beta, and Gamma Metroids. True Metroids look more like giant lizards up until they turn into the Queen Metroid, who is a bitch, to be honest. This game was remade with their more invested audience in mind, since several of the bosses in this game are real pains in the brain. I had several near-hour slugging matches with the Digatron, Proteus Ridley, and the Queen Metroid. And while I do like the boss fights of each one, since they are complicated, they do have the presentation with heavy-hitting sounds, flashy attack effects, and a lot of attacks at their disposal to make Samus have a bad time. When your boss is hitting an hour on attempts, unless you're like a Souls-like, it's probably time to switch some numbers around, to be honest. Since those bosses are so complicated and intricate, I'm not truly angry at their difficulty. They could be improved to have the game flow better, but as set pieces, they are damned really good, since they have great designs, especially since most of this is brand new content. What does help the annoyance is that this game has modern features and reloads you at the boss's door instead of at the save station. However, due to the Metroid formula, some bosses do get repetitive, since you only have 4 forms of regular Metroids in the game, and 40 to go and kill, so the hunting can honestly drag a little bit. But for Metroid fans, this game is definitely the one for you. After doing the research, this game is a vast Metroid title. I clock my time at about a dozen hours, so 9 of those were doing actual exploring, and with so many tools at your disposal, the exploration is technical and makes for some nice map weaving. However, the actual maps of this game are kind of underwhelming. It's a slight issue that the maps don't pop off the screen like how they should for an HD 3D outing. The designs just look a little lackluster. The colors are muted and the backgrounds don't interact with the foreground, and since this game lacks DKC 3D map angling, it also gets a little bit stale. That and a lighter touch on plot points are really my only complaints about the remake. While not a heartfelt remake of the original, what we did get was an amazing overhaul. You get everything in the kitchen sink with this game. This one has given you so many of the previous entries' power-ups along with a few that they just made up on the spot to give you even more. You get the Spider Ball, all of Super Metroid's beam upgrades, the Screw Attack, the Grapple Beam, the Speed Booster, the Spider Ball, and the Power Bomb. The new additions are the Aeon abilities, which are a gauge-based power-up. However, these things just are not that useful. They didn't come up through my playthrough, but you do get an invisible block detector, bullet time, and a phaser upgrade. I'm not sure why a map sonar was put on as an Aeon ability, but it's the nicest one in the lot, since invisible blocks were always a bugbear of the Metroid franchise. I cannot tell you how many times I've been stymied in Metroid games and looked up the walkthrough only to find that I was stuck by a path that was blocked by invisible stuff. This is something that the series needed for quite a while. This game is just stocked butt to gut with so many upgrades that Samus Returns feels like the trial run for Metroid Dread. It has a lot of that game's enhancements along with a similar map and travel mechanics. While having such a big map, they did add in proper Metroidvania teleporters into the mix that help break up the tedious backtracking, even if backtracking to the teleporters is also a part of Samus's quest since they aren't everywhere, and I'm sure all teleporters aren't actually networked to each other. So, after traversing this lovingly remade map and defeating the full lot of 40 Metroids, seeing their evolutions come and go, and shooting down the main Queen Metroid to fill out the list, Samus comes upon the last sample, an intact Metroid egg that hatches in front of her. The baby Metroid imprints on Samus for whatever reason and begins tagging along with her. Samus debates with herself about this since the baby Metroid isn't attacking her and decides to pseudo-adopt it for now. With her mission kinda completed, Samus returns to her ship for a job well done, only to be stopped by more remake content in Proteus Ridley. Looking at this Ridley might be confusing for some of you who haven't been around the block as much, since Metroid has an odd timeline. What happened between the first two Metroid games is actually the entire Metroid Prime trilogy. So this is one of Ridley's final appearances and why its cybernetics look so upgraded. This is canonically the 6th time we're blowing him up with missiles. This Ridley is absolutely on top of his shit. He attacks with vast and vicious strikes. His tool set is fire breath attacks, claw swipes, and his classic ground smash. His weapons of choice aren't hard to dodge since the arena is so huge, and Samus's infinite jumps make easy work to get around him. It's the fact that his entire body is an active hurt box, and for huge damage too. Just touching Ridley is around 60 to 70 HP loss, which is why my attempts took so long. It's because of that simple mistake. I do love the design for his robotics. They are brilliant, and not having to deal with precise hitboxes on his mouth or chest is really nice, plus not being restricted to missiles just to get some damage. Another feature of this game that I forgot to mention is that on some boss battles, when you hit their parries, you sometimes go into cinematic gun blasting, which looks vicious from Samus going directly to the boss's face and hitting their weak spots for the big damage. These are incredibly detailed animations, and I love seeing what Samus decides to do in battle when she gets her opportunity. I wouldn't have made Ridley pink. I would have tried to go with his classic scaly purple like what we got in Smash Brothers, since not having that detail on Ridley's own body takes away from his look, to be honest. But other than that, this was a great add from the dev team, and I liked fighting the last Ridley. I also love the green storm of the battlefield to make it look like the final showdown in a unique way. This storm of apocalyptic proportions makes a satisfying backdrop for this nemesis duel. The only small issue being the tornado in the background that looks like it came from a PS2 texture. That just didn't need to be there, and honestly it looks dreadful, but dark green for the backdrop was a really good choice. Haven't seen that done in a long time. So, with another mission in the bag, Samus and Baby Metroid move on to new missions, and the eradication of the Metroids leaves the universe at peace once more. Except for the post-credits scene, which shows that the X-Parasites also came from SR-388. God damn it, fuck. The remake of Samus 2 was definitely worth the wait. The devs took their time and pulled elements from the whole franchise to make this Metroid showcase. Taking the concept of Metroid 2 and using that as a springboard to make the most Metroid game ever, building in a few new features that were unprecedented to make for some creative and visceral combat. A whole host of puzzles and map movement to make for this intricate journey, adding in quality of life improvements that this series was needing for also a long time, and producing a stark and new 3D underground map to set their remake in, though the quality of the map designs aren't as good as they should be. It is the game that showed to be the trial run for what Dread would have eventually become, and while it doesn't make up for Nintendo's fucking over of the fans, it certainly does for one of the better playing Metroid titles. I wish that they could have had some more good plot stuff to pack into this too, like Zero Mission, but that's not really a complaint that I have with Samus Returns, since the gameplay makes for such a kick-ass reimagining of an important time in Metroid's history that it kinda gets around the lacking story bits. It's just overall an excellent job, guys. You really hit the nail on the head with this one. Now, we finally come to the game that started it all. Or at least, restarted it. The one that was so good that Nintendo never needed to remake it. Metroid 3 on the SNES. Super Metroid had a lot to live up to back in the day. After Nintendo pioneered their idea with the NES, it was time for the bounty hunter to make the long-awaited return to the 16-bit days. All of those improvements that we say with the original's remakes was originally done on the Super Metroid. This was the game that was putting all of its cards on the table, and all these enhancements and new ideas that Nintendo thought of for its SNES reintroduction of one of their mascots. This is the game that brought us Shine Sparking, the Grapple Beam, the Power Bomb, the Spazer, and the Split Beam, and the Plasma Beam, and the iconic new suits for Samus that gives out new powers on top of new defenses. Plus a couple new bosses which would themselves become iconic, such as Phantoon. After the original Metroid, Nintendo went big for their follow-up and gave us a huge Metroid planet to work our way across, with multiple regions, each with their own gimmick to work around, such as the water region and the lava levels. Even one attempted doing a pseudo-horror level in the Crash Frigate that wasn't scary at all. All the lights were just out, and we had to fight a ghost called Phantoon, but then again, that's Metroid pseudo-horror in a nutshell. It's never scary, it's just really dark. In Super Metroid, after the events of Metroid 2, Samus decided to return the baby Metroid to the Federation in order to study their energy siphoning powers, and they were working on theories to translate their abilities to the greater good. But unfortunately, the Federation didn't learn their lesson after what happened on Zebes, and the Space Pirates attacked the undefended Ceres Station and made off with the baby Metroid, thereby making Samus the reason why the galaxy was no longer at peace. But that's unfair, since a couple of organizations also did the same thing. There will always be more Metroids. Samus has to track down Ridley and the Space Pirates in order to destroy their Metroid research once and for all, and what better place to go than the rebuilt Zeba's facility for another go-round. Super Metroid actually makes a humorous callback to the original by having the first place you go to be the opening level of the original game, where you pick up the Morph Ball where it was all that time ago. Fortunately, they abandoned that callback idea pretty quick when we get to see some proper Metroid-style 16-bit graphics that allowed Nintendo to implement a lot of the ideas they were attempting to back on the NES. An alien world full of strange insects and other lizard, dinosaur, plant monsters that want to kill Samus as she traverses the world. The proper Metroidvania exploration is on full force here as we get to experience a full 10 or so boss fights in the world, and Samus fights around for her many power-ups on her way to being an infinite jumping super missile 3-way beam shooting badass that can jump at infinite speed in one direction. The movement got technical and the map movement got more maze-like and puzzly, along with many optional upgrades in health and missiles to track down throughout your exploration. Surprisingly, like Majora's Mask, Metroid put in quality of life stuff a lot earlier than I thought with the implementation of the X-ray visor, which allows Samus to see through invisible blocks. That gives a lot of points to Metroid, since invisible blockages are one of the worst aspects of the franchise, so kudos for doing that in your third game. The main point of this whole journey to become the best that ever was is that similar to the original. There's another statue blocking our way to the core of Zebes, and like Dark Souls, there's 4 big bad monsters that need to be taken down before the way is opened. Likewise, there's not much plot beyond that. Samus catches up on the story at the start, we see Ridley fly away, and then we end up back where we started to blow it all up for a second time. Find upgrades, kill bosses, get freaked out when the Chozo statues try to kill Samus. Everything in this game is top notch. It is one of the greatest Metroidvania journeys ever made. Almost everything about it is right on the money. It's the perfect length, the map is right for creative layout, gimmicks, and hidden secrets, the movement is fantastic, and the shooting has been revamped to be a joyous barrage of sci-fi death. The lack of plot points being the one thing holding it back, but even then this game is right on the edge of a 10 out of 10. Most of the stuff that would become iconic happened right here. Nintendo fully learning what fans wanted from the first 2 outings and delivering in fantastic fashion from a dev team that was absolutely on the top of their game. However, I would be remiss to not mention that there is a possibility in this game to get pseudo soft-locked if you don't follow the expected path. I actually got fucked over on my review playthrough for not finding one of the beam upgrades. The charge beam was forgotten, and this is a requirement for finishing the final boss due to how the rainbow beam works. Similar to the first game, we don't get to see Metroids until endgame due to them being hardy enemies weak to limited weapons, and hard to kill when they're in packs. Likewise, the final level might look a little familiar. Yeah, this is the same rundown to the Zeeb's core with the defense units and the 3 shields on the final battle. Hell, you get there and yeah, it's Mother Brain again in its same stupid fucking jar. Do the same thing, come on, let's get out of here. Use your 100 missiles to get through all the defenses, smash the brain to goo again, and get ready to hear that iconic alarm. Actually, no. Something else happens. Instead of the door opening, the Mother Brain shell falls apart, the acid gets drained away, only for the corpse of Mother Brain to grow a dinosaur-like body and begin a second phase. Yeah, that's, different. The fight with Mother Brain 2 is actually kind of a letdown. The fight is so simplistic and the boss is so huge that there's only 2 ways that this fight could go. You either dodge everything super easy and get the damage you need, or everything goes badly and your health gets smashed in stupid fast, in that way where you didn't make a bunch of mistakes. It's just that the boss is taking up so much space and their attacks just nail you repeatedly with bullshit. It does make for a cool story moment, but the whole battle is piss weak, since you get one of those stupid final death weapons just for the final boss that takes Mother Brain apart in 30 seconds. The baby Metroid makes it down to the final battle and siphons off Mother Brain's power to bestow upon Samus, but then Mother Brain kills the baby Metroid. The devastation of that allowing Samus to unleash the final upgrade, the Rainbow Beam on Mother Brain, which wrecks the final boss and finally opens up the alarm door, doing the same thing that the original did. Zebes is about to explode. This time it isn't a random hop up a huge shaft, this time it's a labyrinthine runaround which gives you an optional thing if you can scrape together the time to do. There's a group of intelligent Zeeb's creatures that Samus saw earlier in the game, and she can save them from the explosion by opening their cage if you so choose. They don't actually do anything but appear in a couple ending cutscenes for some warm fuzzies if you're into that sort of stuff. Even in future installments, they don't actually do anything, so it's your choice to continue caring about them. For a game that has the balls to call itself one of the greatest of all time, I can't think of many that fits the bill quite as much as Super Metroid. Developers learning so much about Metroidvania in the original game in such a short time frame to build this masterpiece is legitimately stupefying. Being able to take the events of the original and subvert them for added tension is masterful, and perfecting the difficulty curve is marvelous. If you are unsure about Metroidvania being for you as a genre, you could not go wrong with Metroid 3 being your introduction, since you get a proper catch-up so that you aren't going to be lost in the story, and a major event in the franchise's canon happens right here. This game is the Super Mario World of Metroid games, and it is amazing to me that Nintendo got 2 of these for their flagship series on the Super Nintendo. Maybe they'll keep being this good as the years continue. And now we get on to this game, the time that Nintendo tried to take the Metroid series in a new direction. So the beginning of this mission is Samus receiving a call from Federation HQ telling her to go help out a research team working on SR-388 once again. During the expedition, Samus runs into an unknown life form in the form of an animal, but when attacked, it reverted back to its original form to latch onto Samus. She falls unconscious during flight and crash lands, and was taken to a research vessel where they attempted to save her from the organism that was now multiplying within her body. Due to not having any time, the science team decided to use research done on the baby Metroid's DNA to derive a vaccine for the parasitic attack. Due to the quick fabrication of this medicine, it worked, and eradicated the parasites, leaving Samus damaged but alive, due to the necessity of the science team to permanently remove large parts of her power armor to work on her rehabilitation. Now she's being thrown into a new mission to return to the research station due to an emergency situation unfolding on the satellite. This was a new engine that Nintendo had built to move the series onto the GBA that would be co-opted by Zero Mission. The new style has sharper pixel art, more explosive effects, and an enhanced HUD for the player to be able to easily work with the game's map, equipment, and stat readouts, all done perfectly on the new hardware. The major addition to the engine is the ability to render cutscenes in a couple spots to help punctuate major events that unfold as Samus figures out what's going on. The only complaint is that Nintendo didn't shove more of these in, since they could have been a backbone to a hard-hitting survival story, instead of just being the occasional highlight to something that would have worked well enough in engine. The addition of diagonal shooting, a quicker Samus, and crisper map design makes it a quick, tightly platforming adventure that shows that Nintendo was still improving the Metroidvania design, while sticking to the craft of a bunch of the bigger set pieces. Samus going into the situation isn't afforded intel, assumingly because the science team had to evacuate or got caught in the explosion too fast to provide much of a stat update. It doesn't strike me as that odd that Samus arrives and finds no staff members and thankfully no corpses, but this gives us our first glimpse of the tone of the game as Samus runs around the staff areas with no other people. The one point of contact that we do have is that Samus frequently checks in with a new AI that she's been forced to work with. This computer will give her the rundown of current objectives and give hints and orders on what to do as the game progresses. There's more going on than what we know as the computer speaks in vagaries and is pretty light on details. This is the game that begun the characterization of Samus, as a few times in the game, Samus gives the player long-winded monologues that would play into how she conducts herself in Other M, as these are the only real times where Samus speaks up. I appreciate the attempt that Nintendo gives to put some traits into what had been a silent protagonist for so long, but it seems like no one that tried was able to come up with something that didn't sound like a robot trying to learn human emotions secondhand, which, considering her Chozo upbringing, makes sense. Upon learning that the samples from the expedition have been taken here, Samus goes to check on those labs to get a status of what was accomplished on those studies. There she learns that the parasites, called the X-parasites, have the ability to copy organisms down to their minute details, which is what she saw on SR-388. Samus' unique ability gained from her parasitisation, and the vaccine allows her to absorb the X-parasites in order to regain health and special abilities. This is when Samus remembers that the portions of her power armor were also taken to this lab, and they have now exploded. This is where we get one of the most famous scenes from Metroid as the franchise. Samus goes down an elevator to continue investigating, only for the shaft to be blasted open, and we get to hear the iconic first footsteps of Samus Aran X, shortened to Sax. The pupilless stare of the fake Samus is one of the Nintendo cutscenes that will live on for a while, and this is where we get what Fusion is attempting to go for: classic sci-fi horror. We don't have many details, something unseen is sabotaging the facility, and there's no backup coming for Samus. All she has is her wits, what weapons she can recover, and a whole host of monsters on the loose. It's what the Metroid series should have been trying to do for a while here, and I appreciate the attempt that Nintendo made to give us movie-style horror tones for this game. It feels like a game with a vision to try and make something throwbacky and unique as a story in the series. But we're gonna rip off that band-aid off right now. Nintendo being Nintendo did not manage to make this whole horror aspect come across. The obvious issue is that it's not scary. There are a handful of moments that feel unnerving and unsettling, and Nintendo tries their hardest to convey a spooky atmosphere. But the game is about as terrifying as a slasher wielding a trowel. Fusion drops the attempt to keep the atmosphere going multiple times by going to places that aren't under a monster attack or has any impact on Samus' safety, along with the obstacles that Samus comes across, and the unseen intruders don't come to harm her or play up the horror angle that Fusion was trying for. Her main obstacle are locked doors locked by actual locks. All she has to do are track down key codes to make progress, and it seems like the bosses are 50-50 on the whole horror thing, where some of them can be unsettling cyborg sort of things. And then we get the usual giant plant or lizard thing. We also get the forest level and lava level as per Metroid tradition, which are not scary locations without a direct threat to Samus in her journey through those levels, which is kind of needed to be a real spooky game. I really wish that Nintendo would have stuck to their guns and made a scaled back horror Metroid game, but the problem is that in Metroidvania, it's going to be a harder genre to push what horror requires, since the game is about building yourself up with acquiring abilities to get around and shoot more painful bullets at people's faces, so you lose the whole vulnerability angle of the scary game. The antagonism of this game is so off-screen that it loses another angle of being scary where there's legitimate threats. If Sax was more like Nemesis and had multiple forms bearing down on her more times, then maybe that could have been helped. But we have like 2 encounters with it when it's an invincible menace before we acquire the ability to deal with Sax, which makes it weird that by the end, right when we do acquire that power, is when Sax begins multiplying itself. That could have been a spooky moment if we ran into multiple Sax before we could deal with it. It is a true shame that Fusion isn't a scary game and only delivering scary chapters around 25% of the time, since this could have been something fantastic like the storyline of Super Paper Mario if the creative team had stuck to their guns and forced the terror onto the player rather than just dropping the ball all the goddamn time. Something that the Fusion team did do correctly is that it's very clear that the AI knows something that Samus doesn't, due to how much she has to be directed by it and how clear it is that the AI knows most of the facility's operations and where the important objectives are. Also, with a couple of times that the AI is seen away from Samus discussing some bigger issue with its higher-ups. If Fusion pulled out a plot twist that shook the foundations of what Samus knows about the facility and the Federation, then this plot thread could have strengthened the entire game rather than being let down by being too obvious and a meaningless point by the end. It's one of those cool ideas that isn't implemented throughout the game for it to be an important story arc. Fusion is a cool concept for a Metroid game let down all over the place by slipshod implementation. This could have been the Majora's Mask of Metroid games, but it didn't do enough in the journey to make that a reality. However, while the horror suffers, the Metroidvania progression is pretty solid. A decent lineup of power-ups, the golden oldies are back with multiple suits and phasers to be found, along with a huge armada of missile upgrades. Fusion is also pretty linear in comparison to the franchise, as you'll get let down some very specific off-map paths through specifically built tunnels in one-time only areas, as they'll either become unnecessary or be removed from the station. This is one point where Fusion could be seen as a lesser game, since it's one of those muddled elements. If you remove the free exploration of a Metroidvania to focus on story, then the story needs to be rock solid to make up for that fundamental loss. But it's not there, and thus it becomes a problem. This also leads into the map design having issues. Due to the nature of the station, you mainly get to them by going through a central elevator instead of the levels being interconnected to each other. They still are, but not as much as other games, and it ends up making the map feel like it has all these unnecessarily windy backtracking loops when you need to run back for story elements or hitting everywhere for 100% completion. Again, this would have been a good match to a more story-focused Metroidvania, where you could have a specific progression through each level and then not return to it to hit more story beats, but again, that was muddled and therefore becomes a frustrating grind. This is helped out by Fusion's maps being smaller than the previous games so that the levels aren't that labyrinthine. The gameplay feels like the team was sitting on the fence about the project and did not pick a side, and so earns the disadvantages of both styles. Fusion does have some interesting concepts, though. After the original destruction of the Lab X parasites, the X parasites know about Samus's ability to kill them and goes into a hyper-defensive mode, using their acquired abilities from absorbing the wildlife of SR-388 to get into the inner workings of the satellite and sabotage everything, blowing up portions of the levels, overdriving lava pumps, destroying environmental systems, melting down gravity generators, and a whole host of random problems pop up as Samus struggles to track down the X-Parasites that split off her set of abilities from the Super Metroid Power Armor, along with the security keys to access further parts of the station after everything got locked down. While the progression is too linear, the story does keep up a good pace, and if it was paired with a kick-ass story, this would have been a fantastic narrative through Metroidvania land, rather than this muddled mess that we got. Fortunately, we do get the brilliant scene where Samus has to run away from Sax, which would have been good if the path to get away from it wasn't so split-second timed, and Sax didn't one-hit kill you when you made a mistake, which makes what could have been a great section into bad stealth, death by annoyance, along with the iconic Nightmare boss fight brought forth, since it was the one boss fight that was foreshadowed as a sabotage by itself. Having the gravity generator that Samus needed, it broke out of its holding cell and began wreaking havoc on its level, destroying environmental controls, along with the game showing the audience its shadow throughout the level before Samus gets a real look at it, and then the progression of its boss battle as it takes damage is the sort of stuff that Fusion could have been in another universe, where Nintendo committed to producing a horror game. Huge shame that it's the one boss outside of the security drone that commits to being creepy. As Samus and the computer continue to throwing bandages on the station's boo-boos at breakneck speed and we get more hints that the computer is lying to Samus, we get into the end game and the one thing that the AI did not want us to see. A secret sub-level that Samus manages to morph ball her way into and discovers notes on Metroid experimentation. After all this effort she put in to exterminate their species, apparently the Federation were rebooting the scientific work on it for some vague beneficial application to humans, and that's when we find the Metroid breeding facility. The Federation had managed to keep enough Metroid samples on hand to begin cloning the damn things. Since they were both from the same planet, the Metroids that escape, since everything is blowing up, they are the predators for the X-Parasites. And this can help up until the point where the secret lab is jettisoned from the station and crash lands onto the planet. This is where we get to the end game, since the AI is informing Samus that at this point with everything going wrong, she should evacuate and let the army clean up the situation, since there's nothing more that she can do. Samus disagrees and says that with the X getting more powerful, no force in the universe can handle this, and it would be providing the parasites with more of an advantage to break out and destroy galactic civilization. So, in classic Metroid fashion, Samus has to detonate the entire station to save the universe. With the fake Samuses having gained the ability to multiply, she has to duck as many of them as possible and make it to the self-destruct sequence where she's encountered by one of the most mutated Sacs for their first showdown, since she's been fully powered up. After defeating Sax, the parasite mutates again with her power armor, shifting into a horrifying ball of teeth and claws, which is a brutally difficult battle that takes advantage of the huge space that you have to fight it in, along with the specific way you have to kill it using multiple weapons while it's jumping around, spending almost half of the battle off screen due to it attacking straight up in a fight is a good way to take a whole bunch of damage, and even beyond that, like other X-Cores, she has to fight it as well, which can be a bitch since it's the last one. It's got the most health, and it's faster than all the others. Take it out and get gypped as the core decides to vacate the arena rather than giving us our final power-up. Well, we don't have time to be disappointed as Samus has to take the short jaunt to the docking bay and leave only to find her ship gone and none are there to help along with something returning from Zero Mission. One final beastie has come out of the woodwork to defeat Samus right before the front door, the Omega Metroid. One last one that managed to evolve this far. Being a super evolved Metroid, it is immune to Samus' entire arsenal, and also manages to destroy all of her energy tanks in one hit. Coincidentally, this is when the core that she was fighting earlier rematerializes into Sax to take on the Metroid itself, but it also gets defeated quickly, meaning that it now decides to form together with Samus in order to give her access to the Ice Beam, the only thing that it's weak to. At this point, the boss fight turns really simple. The Metroid can hit Samus for 100 energy a pop, and sometimes for multiple hits in a row, knocking off 3 tanks in 2 seconds. But that's also its only attack, and it gets stunned really easy, so only difficulty in this fight is that it's timed. Unless you dicked around too much before it, you'll always have enough time to kill it and get out if you figure it out right. In a final act of respect, the AI calls Samus' ship down in time to pick her up and blaze off the station just as it crashes into SR-388, saving the universe from both existential threats. I really liked Fusion personally, and its attempts to pull together a narrative to follow with these horror elements that brought something brand new to the table. It's just that the game is not committed to holding up the atmosphere of the game that it really needs, and giving us consistent threats to fight against, and is more interested in a typical Metroidvania progression through power-ups and boss fights, rather than getting deviously powerful monsters and hard-hitting story beats, and survival limitations. Fusion is a game of two halves that end up competing with each other and bringing out the strengths of neither. A great Metroid experience that is disappointing in that notion that it was developed half-cocked. These elements have shown up in later Metroid games and they are cool concepts, but Nintendo needs to fully commit to them and make a whole game with this horror style. And then there's that possibility we'll get something as compelling as Super Paper Mario in the Samus universe. Hey y'all, we finally get to talk about Metroid Prime now. To recap you guys, this is the one game that I can think of that was a good game with an interesting development cycle. Usually games that have better stories around the game than the game itself are actually quite terrible. This is the exception because if any of you have played Prime and thought that everything went smoothly with its creation, have I got some news for you. Retro Studios was a brand new developer once they started work on the build that would eventually become Prime. Supposedly the reason why Metroid never came out on the 64 was because Nintendo HQ couldn't think of a way to make it work. Nintendo then decided to farm out the idea to Retro since the owner's previous venture, Turok, worked well for them before. And this new developer would give it a Western feel, which was something they were interested in at the time. Surprisingly, Retro started out in Texas and they hit it big with their first idea. They were given ideas to work on but no GameCube development kits and therefore came up with 4 ideas. Metaphors, a shooter, an NFL football game, an RPG, and a car combat game. After visits from the higher-ups at Nintendo of Japan, they were mostly disappointed. However, the one shining moment for Miyamoto was their early build of Metaphors. Nintendo thought that they could bend the project into a proper Metroid game, so Retro scrapped everything they were working on and began working on a Metroid project by itself. The first issue was that the team thought that the GameCube was going to be a stronger platform than what it was, so when they actually got the specs, they had to completely start over. Then there was the bigger problem. What type of shooter should they make? Retro aimed at a third-person shooter, but after having problems with Jet Force Gemini, Nintendo didn't like that idea and pushed for first-person. And there was some back and forth on this that led to partial scrapping of the project again. Apparently the early days were such a mess that it took Retro a full 6 months to even get a single level approved by Nintendo for Prime. They fought hard to get some third-person action in the game, which is why you actually see Samus using machines and the all-important Morph Ball feature that provides some side-scrolling platforming to the game's exploration. Another issue was that Nintendo didn't have direct control of the development, being limited to occasional in-person visits, phone conferences, and a litany of emails which contributed to the sluggish production. The Morph Ball sections being a huge bugbear due to the details of how to make it actually happen. How should it control? How should we transition between perspectives? What should we have them do in those sections? And seeing the two mesh together in the final product, I can see the host of problems from having it included. But as some voices from the team said after they chose first person, they didn't want to just make a shooter. They wanted to make an explorative Metroid game, and so they had to bend an FPS-styled game around that idea. They decided to scale back difficulty in the open world areas to give players freedom to explore. Halfway into production, Nintendo entered into a deal with Retro to purchase large amounts of stock from the owner and became a first-party developer. And now that things have been going on a smoother pace, Retro was finally in line to meet their deadline. Unfortunately, allegedly, Prime was also a victim of crunch culture, with it being reported that during the final 9 months of development, Retro was steadily working 80 to 100 hour weeks to hit the deadline Nintendo set, which to be honest is kind of fucked up Nintendo to be crunching down on them that hard. 9 goddamn months, man. So, with the game released from a fledgling super novice developer, what did we actually get? Prime takes place after the original Metroid, once Samus left Zebes to go see a distress signal from a space pirate frigate about some experiment gone awry. This will be your tutorial to first-person Metroiding. Surprisingly, it controls really well. Lengthy jumps so that you can maneuver around, joystick aiming for your shots, slow enemy projectiles to deal with the manual aiming, freedom to enter morph ball puzzles, and most tools being operated with the crosshairs makes for an intuitive gameplay formula in first person. The first showing of Prime is fantastic for something that was invented out of whole cloth. After investigating and finding no one alive in typical fashion, Samus prepares to leave until she's interrupted by the Parasite Queen, which was the experiment that got wrong. With its intermittent shielding, the Parasite Queen is the first showcase of how the major encounters are going to go with the game, and it's quite a nice showcase. It makes use of Samus' jumping to dodge, the manual aiming to get around the Queen's shields and shoot her in the weak spot. It has the appropriate health for the stage of the game, and somewhat painful attacks to bring about some consequences for you fucking up. It's a nice introduction to the new first-person boss battles and shows some promise. The frigate is going to explode, obviously, so Samus has to get off the ship, only to meet up with someone unexpected. Ridley makes an appearance and heads toward the planet that the frigate was orbiting. She swoops down to intercept him, which begins the planet-sized training mission to fight her draconic nemesis. In a new tradition, Samus got into an accident on board the frigate and managed to disable all of her power-ups. You'll be seeing this plot point a lot in future Metroid games. The whoops and everything breaks moment. From this moment, the direct plot falls away as Samus is left to explore the world of Talon 4 on her own, disconnected from any characters or people that don't want to kill her. When you get to Talon 4, you notice that Prime has more focus on the world. Due to it being in first person, you get the ability to take in the surroundings with much more detail, and the game has much more detail in it, from new enemy designs to the different regions of Talon. It is quite the realized map for Prime, especially since Prime has to secret away a lot of collectibles in the game in weird corners and crannies, necessitating the 3D nature of Prime's world design. It really isn't an FPS in the usual sense, since the perspective is used more for looking around rather than shooting evil in the face, and at the start, the world feels like a natural habitat. Like what previous Metroid games did, but now in the most literal way. Animals that she encounters don't immediately attack her on sight, and you get an opportunity to see what these critters do, live their own lives, and have instincts that they follow. It does look like you wandered into the wilderness instead of the wilderness being a backdrop for a Metroidvania runaround. That's not to say you don't get a full suite of power-ups in a true Metroidvania adventure in Prime. There are your traditional huge set of missiles to hunt down, along with a more limited set of traditional power-ups, due to Retro's novice knowledge of Metroid and the limitations when going from first to third person. But on the flip side, first-person Samus does get some new tricks up her sleeve, such as a more literal X-ray visor and infrared that allows her to see more of the world, along with something new. She does get super upgrades for those beams with the flamethrower and the ice spreader. Super missile sort of blasts that are fun while not at all being useful. The toolkit has slimmed down a little bit, but it does make up for it with a litany of creative platforming, puzzles, and something else that made this game iconic was the scan visor. For how it comes across in Prime, this was an entirely new feature dreamed up by the collaboration to mesh with their focus on the world design. To make up for not having a traditional plot, Retro decided to go for total lore building for their game narrative. Every location and room in the game has a cornucopia of flavor text to find. And this improved the formula of Metroid to such a great extent, since the flavor text is on so many things and so full of detail that it breathes life into a world that is devoid of NPCs or really any plot points whatsoever. The one plot touch of this game is in the snowy area, where you get to see a shadow of Meta Ridley flying overhead, and that's really it. Just to remind you of your goal, and that's the one time he reminds the audience that he exists before you actually face him. Not only do you get diaries on what the Chozo and Space Pirates were doing here before they abandoned the planet, but we do get hints about stuff that happens during Endgame, and what's more interesting is that both factions have different perspectives on the same event and speak about it differently, since the Space Pirates are more interested in science and the Chozo are weird religious hermits that all died of the event. It's called the Great Poison, and a long time ago a strange asteroid crashed into Talon 4 and brought a host of problems that killed all of the Chozo, leaving these strange ruins for Samus to explore. In order to stem the tide, the Chozo managed to seal the poison underground, and now the Space Pirates have showed up to harness that power for themselves, along with some other things on the planet. The most famous flavor text for this game is found on a Space Pirate lab, where they discuss trying to harness the abilities of Samus, and specifically the Morph Ball. The pirates attempt to make a pirated copy of her Morph Ball ability, and on their first test manage to kill the tester by breaking all of the bones in their body. The obsessive detail of the scan data that you can find, down to having made up measurements in periods of time, is astounding, and gives this whole new dimension to how you view Talon 4 as a place where living people worked and watched and wrote all of it down, and that's not to say what it's most useful for, giving tips and tricks on how to beat puzzles and boss fights. The only complaint to have about scanning is that the UI for scanning is uniform, and a few times hitting the scan markers can be a bit tricky, and it does have a bit of a range issue. Speaking of ambience, the soundtrack for Prime is absolutely amazing. Since the game has no dialogue or cutscenes in it, the soundtrack has to carry the game hard, and it manages beautifully, since they nailed how a wilderness is supposed to sound like, combined with having some emotional score to back up how the game wants you to feel while going through those locations. Phendrana drifts being the best when you get to the third level. Managing to accomplish this while remaining true to the audio traditions of Metroid's electronic music is perfect. You could not ask for better music to walk around a forest with. The Space Pirate battles will never feel the same again after doing it in Prime. While the difficulty is pretty fair across the first 3 levels, and progression for this game is being okay, there is a distinct lack of shortcuts, and backtracking will be necessary more than it should be, but the maps are small enough and you get movement power-ups quickly enough to make getting around not that annoying. Plus, the fantastic map design does alleviate some of the frustration of forced backtracking. And additionally, another feature that this game adds is that if you take too much time in figuring out what the next thing you're supposed to do, the game will tell you what your objectives are, very literally, and exactly where to go, which is really cool since a Metroidvania can be problematic if you don't know where you're actually supposed to be going. So getting those very specific objectives is really nice. But it could have been better, especially since your only fast travel option are fixed elevators between regions, and there's not a lot of them, especially when you realize that one level is only accessible via another level, so you have to run through 2 levels to get there. Lack of quality of life is a noticeable issue in Prime. The one part that sticks out is the Phazon mine. Phazon is an important plot element in this game. Phazon is implied by the Chozo to be incredibly poisonous, but the Space Pirates have discovered that it has mutagenic qualities that they're attempting to harness. The problem being that 85% of their test subjects die in Phazon experiments. It's basically the G-Virus from Resident Evil in Nintendo Land. It does random mutations and gives a bunch of new members of the Space Pirate clan, such as the Samus Pirates, that are weak to specific beams due to gaining experimental versions of her power-ups. Brutish, huge pirates that just punch things, and later the boss, who gives you one of the better looking suit upgrades, is the most advanced Phazon experiment that they managed to make. The problem with the Phazon mine level is that it's deliberately designed to have no breaks. It's a huge, winding, enemy-stuffed area with few save points to help you out, and you have to scavenge what you can to come out of the enemies trying to kill you, and a bunch of them do pack a hell of a punch. It's a survival gauntlet that'll be your testing ground for the second half of the game. Around this point of the game, we also learn that the Space Pirates have managed to bring back our old friends to the fray. Yes, there were also Metroids on Talon 4 that the Space Pirates have been working on, and that went its usual route with the jellyfish breaking out and killing all of their handlers and ruining everything. In Prime, the Metroids aren't so bad, and they're actually pretty killable, which is good when they get dunked into Phazon later and get even worse. With most of the planet explored by now, Prime moves into its late game once you deal with the Phazon Pirate and acquire your Phazon suit, which allows you to freely walk through Phazon areas and looks amazing. Dark Samus armor that looks fantastic, especially when you combine these changes with the Morph Ball, and you get to see even more cosmetic changes to Samus. And speaking of which, a nice detail that Prime added to immerse you even more into your journey. With weapon effects, you do get a glimpse of Samus's eyes to give you more of a connection to her as a character. And it is a really nice touch that adds just that little bit extra for palling around with her on her quest. And there's also a further nice detail that Samus chooses her beam selection through her hand gestures inside of her gun. You can only see this with the X-ray visor, but she does in fact change her hand position to do that. It's another really odd level of detail to flesh out Samus' character in an unprecedented way because this is first person. Retro did go all out in this game, and I suppose they did have to work on something during 100-hour weeks for almost a year. The endgame of Prime is a shame though, but also necessary for what kind of game it is. The whole thing is annoying, but you do get enough hints from the flavor text to figure this out, and there's also the nice addition that you can work on starting this before you get to the final door, as a couple of these items can be found by accident. In order to get to the endgame, the Chozo have left a final challenge for Samus, needing to find 12 keys across the planet to open the seal they placed on the Great Poison. The Chozo artifact bit is annoying since it's just a huge pile of backtracking. Even if the riddles are somewhat clever to figure out where they are, I can see how they wanted to focus on the world they built as a final puzzle, but this is just a really dumb waste of time right at the end. After dumping another hour or so into picking all of them up, we return to open the seal only for this entire thing to finally come full circle. Meta Ridley comes barreling down on the artifact site, and we get the battle that we've been training this entire game for. The Meta Ridley boss battle is iconic for great reasons. It makes full use of the first-person perspective that Samus gets. It stays true to Ridley's earlier skills. The new redesign for him is fantastic. It's in a couple of stages, and it hits the golden level of difficulty. Plus, the two phases have completely different gameplay, where you start with Ridley carpet bombing the arena, and then he loses his power armor and has to fight you on the ground with his claws and jumping. Plus, the remix of Ridley's battle theme has eclipsed the original theme with how perfect of a new spin it is on a classic. It's exactly the boss that the fans wanted as the final culmination with what Samus came down to Talon 4 to do. It's one of the few 10 out of 10 boss fights out there in video games. So Ridley falls down a huge pit, never to be seen again, as he's blasted by the lasers that were installed on the site, and the seal finally does open for Samus to finish out what the Chozo couldn't manage. The Phazon Core is like the Phazon Mine. It's got one checkpoint at the start, and it requires you to run the entire thing in one go while being assailed by mutated Metroids and other beasties on the way, along with waiting for platforms and elongated jumping parts. The Phazon Core is a pain in the ass, and another dumb way to end the game when you have to make this run every time you want to try the final boss, which is just one of those kicks in the balls that retro games had you deal with before quality of life was invented. It was alluded to in earlier flavor text, but the final boss of this game is notably Metroid Prime, the big bad queen of all Metroids and most evolved one that there is. It's also a Phazon thing, so it actually doesn't work with the regular Metroid evolution line that we saw in Metroid 2, so it does make sense. This is a mutation thing. This thing has been spreading all of the evil covering Talon 4 for all of those years, and now Samus is ready to shoot it in the face. Appropriately, Metroid Prime is quite a beast of a boss battle, with the central gimmick being that you have to shoot it in its tiny face with color-coded beams while dodging her projectiles, summons, and charges. It's a frenetic mess of a boss battle that will take you ages since Metroid Prime has a huge health pool. It's not all that bad, just it's kinda too long and sluggish for a set-piece moment, especially when you have to repeat it like 3 times. You do get some refills from the summons in the battle, which contributes to how slow it is, plus the multiple phases where Metroid Prime just keeps retreating further down into the planet, but the battle doesn't really change, just switching to disadvantageous colors and attacking it at a quicker pace. Do this about 3 times, and we break the shell open to see Metroid Prime's true form, a giant jellyfish with a face. In the final phase, the boss fight turns into one of those rainbow beam moments where you're handed a stupidly overpowered weapon to finish the boss with. Samus has to absorb pure Phazon and channel it through her beam at Metroid Prime, which takes longer than it should, since the boss fight doesn't change over time, it's just really long health bars. The only gimmick is that she becomes invisible to only one visor, which is clever, but also annoying, since all this really adds to the battle is cycling through your visor since you know that's the answer, and again, it just doesn't change. You just have to guess which one it is on a time crunch. It is a good thing for this formula that Metroid Prime's attacks are actually garbage. She can summon Metroids and AoE floor rings, and that's pretty much it. Keep up with its pace though, enough and you have finally finished the job. Metroid Prime is defeated and Samus gets to leave Talon 4 knowing that she did a really good job. Although, Metroid Prime did lash out a final time and stole the Phazon suit for some reason. If you did get the super special completionist ending, you do get to know that Metroid Prime did manage to integrate with that suit and climbed out of the Phazon core, supposedly for some reason. Originally, when Metroid Prime came out, it instantly shot up to Game of the Year contender along with the board, and considering a 9.8 from IGN of all people, it did get those awards. And considering that this was a first-time crew with an untested engine slapping it together while under deadline duress, it is staggering how fantastically this all came together. Not that I endorsed the crunch bit while under all that pressure to perform, Retro did manage it in spectacular fashion that no one expected this high quality of work. Putting all these new spins on the Metroid formula and adding so much detail to things that players took for granted ended up putting Metroid in a new sort of spotlight that it hadn't gotten before. Not only being a series known for incredibly paced Metroidvania journeys, but now one that had a real living world behind it made Prime one of the premier games to get on the GameCube platform. There are few and far between complaints with this game, and it is the one survivor of a brutal crunch culture that created it. A true pioneer for a darling series, and it would serve to justify Retro's existence for a bunch of years to come. Thanks 20 years ago, Texas, for bringing us one of gaming's masterpieces. The one thing that you have to remember about the expectations for this game is that Nintendo did not bring out a Metroid game for N64. So we legitimately had like 7 years between Metroid on console. It skipped over a generation and it still came out this amazingly beautifully. Well, that didn't take long. After a brilliant showing from the original, Retro immediately got to work on a sequel and ran into a couple of hurdles. This time it's another mission on a new planet. This time an army squad has gone missing and Samus needs to figure out why. However, once she arrives, she's buffeted by the atmosphere and needs to do a harsh landing, her ship is disabled, and outside communications fail. Here, she explores the makeshift base of the platoon and discovers that all the members have expired due to unknown factors. They were all killed by something. This is the first time that we get to see the scanning improvements for the Prime series. Instead of scanning around for markers, this time we get to scan the object itself to get our data. The level of work on the scanning is similar to Prime, but there's also additional rewards for doing it as each scan is categorized into different groups, such as enemy type, location it was found, and type of knowledge that it is. These can give you different 100% rewards for doing all the scanning and allows easier tracking of what's missing. Another detail is that bosses that have multiple forms give new scan data to reflect those changes. Along with these details, you also get a model of the thing being scanned in case you want to refer to it later. Instead of having to rescan something to read it, you are allowed to slam all of the diaries into a journal for later if you really got to know or you want to pace out your reading time. I like to read each diary the second that I grab it since it's most useful at the place that you found it. The personality of the flavor text is livened up since the first diaries you find from the soldiers give you moments such as the soldiers looking up to Samus as a paragon soldier, some thinking that Samus is a myth like Santa Claus, and one soldier going kind of crazy over time and complaining about how they were stranded here too. The opening of the game is well done, a story of how they got fucked over in personality-laden journal entries. After investigation, Samus does get assailed by what took out the soldiers, a team of dark bug creatures that swarm her and steal many of her suit's systems and then buggered off into another dimension as per usual. At least this makes more sense than slamming into a wall and just breaking everything that you're holding on to. Now that she's lost all of her abilities and is stranded on this strange planet, Samus needs to start learning how to fix all of these problems. Later, she encounters a larger version of one of those dark bug things, and after defeating it, acquires some strange light power. She manages to climb the central tower around this location and finds an NPC, a four-armed insectoid creature that speaks similar to the Chozo. This creature is one of the remaining inhabitants of this planet. The planet is under a dire circumstance. A great asteroid struck their planet and brought the Ing, the dark creatures that Samus has been finding up to this point. Through their invasions, the Ing have been stealing the light source from Aether to a dark mirror world, and the planet is destabilizing as being split in two. The Insect Man tasks Samus with hunting down the remaining energy sources and saving the planet. Thereby, this will remove the interference preventing Samus from leaving. The big issue with this plot is how disconnected it is from the Federation and Samus herself. This is a situation that has no bearing on Samus's life, and she's doing it only out of the goodness of her heart. The real reason why she's forced to do this are completely manufactured. There's no personal attachment to this entire situation or these people, which makes it feel like a colossal annoyance even before the other problems start showing up. Before, we got plots like hunt down space pirates, hunt down Metroids, and the reason why Samus cares is because both of those things are dangers to the entire galaxy. This is some dumb border dispute between two alien clans that we have nothing to do with. The Ing are a danger to Aether, not anywhere else, so the stakes of this game are very low. Using the power of a light teleporter, Samus is able to traverse to Dark Aether and discovers another major problem. The first level of Dark Aether might be the hardest, since you take damage just from standing on it. In order to avoid this, you have to shoot these crystal lanterns that produce safe zones. This mechanic is insanely annoying since the health loss is huge for being the first level in the game, and while you can heal in safe zones, standing still for this long in a Metroid game or really any video game is infuriating to say the least. This mechanic isn't an interesting challenge, it's detrimental to the exploration. It's like the team said when they were working on Prime. They wanted to put the difficulty in the major encounters since the exploration should be free to take in the world. This goes against that, and I can only see the reason that this happened is that the developers got really good at playing Prime, so they wanted to liven it up with a new challenge and just pushed it too goddamn far. Being in Dark Aether is as annoying as hell because it was designed to be that way. Plus, what you have to do here is track down the location of 3 keys to unlock the boss door. The keys are found in hard-to-reach areas that need you to explore the whole level, and Agon Waste is a big place to be. It would be fun to explore if I didn't have to worry about my health bar the entire time. If anything, Echoes is a more frustrating version of Prime for this reason alone. Large amounts of time are spent on Dark Aether with constantly dropping health. Once we get all of the keys, we break into the boss fight, and it's against a giant worm creature. While this boss fight is long and convoluted, and with multiple phases naturally, the boss fights in Echoes kind of suck, from being too much of a slog to having too much damage to being too complicated to the removal of light crystal gimmicks. Dealing with the bosses are not fun, plus design-wise the first couple are pretty meh. Chica and Amorbus. The power-up thief fights are a lot better since they get simple, sleek designs, 1 or 2 gimmicks to show off what they can do with your power-ups, and a better paced fight. The temple bosses are not this game's strong suit, but deal with it enough and Amorbus is a bit easy since you're literally melting for the whole fight, and you finally get equipped with the mother effing dark suit. With the power of the dark suit, the melting effect of Aether is reduced to reasonable, and you can start exploring with a bit more freedom. Now that Retro has gotten the experience under their belt, they've started expanding Samus's toolset as well. She gets more than I thought at this point in the series, since they've started making up new tools as well. On top of your regular Morph Ball, Grapple Beam, Gravity Suit, and Super Missile, we also get new beams in the Light and Dark Beam, which are ammo-based? I'm not really sure why, since those beams aren't that powerful to really earn the restriction, but thankfully ammo is easy to find. All you have to do is shoot things with the other beam to get ammo for that beam, and you also can find this ammo in crates, so just shoot the entire backgrounds constantly for anything that can give you some help. Another cool feature is that to avoid soft locks, you are allowed to shoot the beams even if they're out of ammo by charging them. The shot obviously does no damage, but you can open doors with it. Later on, we also get the Annihilator beam, which combines the two beams together for a stronger attack. It still runs on ammo, it isn't worth it since even the Annihilator beam doesn't do that much damage to earn a double restriction. We also get new forms of the X-ray visor that sees things hidden in pure darkness, charge beam alterations to all three new beams, and the long-awaited return of the screw attack. I'm surprised that they made it work in the Prime gameplay, but damn it if it doesn't kick butt and work as hell of a lot better than you'd think. The only drawback is that you have to jump on a rhythm, and getting that down feels very odd once you first get the power-up. You also don't get infinite jumps. You get like 6 of them in a row, and you have a max range. They also decided to add an odd power-up called the Echo Visor. It's an audio-based gun that allows Samus to interface with Sonic locks, but it works in a strange fashion where the power-up isn't explained well and actually firing it is hard due to the interface not really being legible. I remember having to Google how this thing works because how it's described in-game never made that much sense for what you have to use it for. Probably should have scaled it back to use thing to shoot doors open instead of doing sound pattern puzzles, especially when this thing is involved in one of the major temple boss fights. That's Echoes' biggest failing as a game, it's being innovative with design while not being player-friendly. Now that Amorbis is dealt with, the other shoe begins to drop as we slot in the light ball from the Aegon Waste. There's another 2 of them and you need 3 more keys in each level. Great. I wouldn't have such an issue with this if the next place we were going to wasn't Torvis. If it was anywhere else. I just don't like this area, and that's not surprising considering that it's the game's water level. Something that is always a bugbear since the point of the water level is to slow you down and make it harder to maneuver, and then return your control back with the gravity suit. At least in Echoes they give you an additional feature with the gravity suit instead of just removing all of the jello from the game. Beyond Torvis is a complicated route full of backtracking that ran you in circles around the key before you figured out where to actually go. Plus the addition of Dark Water is really irritating as it's a constant damage hazard. It's a land of irritation that doesn't have the interesting lore or cool gimmicks to back up how annoying it is. And frankly, Chica is not helping. Having a boss fight that's easy in the first half as fighting a whale isn't too hard when it telegraphs where it is and can't do much when it is above water, and its second half is centered entirely on the Seeker missile to follow its sprightly path everywhere in dealing with moving platforms above the Death Water. Additionally, this water level is pretty notorious as its boss, the Alpha Blog, is such a pain as you move slowly in the water and have to fight it on its terms, where you are at a fairly noticeable disadvantage along with a long run back and reruns just to twist the knife further. This boss fight with the item to fix the water problems was frankly insulting. Torvis was not enjoyable, which is kind of odd since it was a return to the plant-infested Chozo ruins just mishandled. The facility level was a great step up for what had been a dragging game as of there. The Sanctuary Fortress is the center of the Insect Men's technological progress, a huge complex of technology that has been abandoned by the meteor strike and sits undisturbed. It's all wasting away, such as dynamos and security drones that will make getting around more difficult as you have to reactivate and stop the machines in certain ways to get to your objectives. The static and defined nature of this level brings something intriguing back into the game, such as the fact that the facility was built. We can find out why and for what purpose, which gives the place a backstory as compared to Torvis, which is just a big swamp with some towers built on top of it. The constructed nature of the sanctuary also helps out the Ing Hive, and getting those keys a bit easier, since getting around its hallways, while confusing, is still easier to do, since the fabricated nature of the facility makes getting around it more sensible. They do integrate more of the teleporting between light and dark to get to places as an additional obstacle, but the sanctuary itself is still a huge improvement right at the end. A grand location full of good puzzles and interesting abilities, this is where we get the Echo Visor and Promise Screw Attack that provide new features for the level rather than Torvis handing you a disadvantage and the power-ups just removes it. Additionally, Quadraxis is a boss with a commanding presence. From the first time you see it, you know it's gonna be trouble. It's an upgraded security drone that's 30 feet tall with 4 legs, and of course that's the boss. So it reactivates under dark power. This fight is a beast of an encounter, a multiple phase slugging match where you have to knock its legs out to get to its core processors and destroy this thing in pieces to finally get to its final CPU. And you have to do all of this with precise shooting and dodging and no safe zones. You are relying on what you can scrounge out of the boss's body and surrounding crates. The battle does give you enough to get by, and at this point in the game you should have enough tanks to get a chance at taking down this marathon machine. This boss battle also integrates the echo visor into it, which is hard to understand, but not as annoying as the multiple noisemaker doors from before. Another problem with the echo visor is that since it's so monocolored, it's actually hard to see any reaction coming from the boss. You finish off the fight with having to boost off of the legs to get onto the head and bomb its internal parts to finally kill it off. Quadraxis was a crazy kitchen sink boss that used everything from the level to make for a badass encounter, even if the lack of save areas is an unneeded issue. Limited save bubbles would have been a better idea, especially since Chica already introduced mechanics that could take them away from you over the boss battle. We should also speak about a couple of the power-up bosses that we've been ignoring up until now for specific reasons. For the most part, the power-up bosses are full of neat gimmicks where they take advantage of your abilities and turn it against you. They have several attacks that they use and are quick enough encounters that they don't take too long, but there are a couple stinkers in there of the 7 or 9. The Boost Guardian and the Spider Guardian. The Boost Guardian takes advantage of its increased speed, which would not be an issue if he had the typical problem of speedy bosses, being a glass cannon. But it doesn't. It's a durable beastie that have the ability to ricochet across the room in random angles to hit you for major damage. Especially when you have to face him before the halfway mark. This is really early on for a boss like this. The Boost Guardian is too tough for how random it is, and then there's the Spider Guardian. Thankfully, Spider Guardian is faced off late in the game, but an additional issue is that you can't see this boss fight coming. You're doing a morph ball puzzle and then you get slammed with a boss health bar right in the middle of it. The other problem is that it's not so much a boss fight as a colossal puzzle room with a boss in it. You have to activate static shocks along the morph ball tracks to do damage in all 3 rooms. It starts off easy, but gets really tough later due to a lack of precise control while in a morph ball mode. Doing all of this on the GameCube's analog stick is not great for something that could fail and get you really hurt really quick. This boss fight is difficult up until the final puzzle, where you have to do track adjustments and timing your activations to get the boss to where you can do damage, and you have to do it 3 times. The morph ball is not for quick movement when you have to bounce yourself between tracks using bombs, and can sometimes get yourself in an unwinnable situation by not planning your actions too far in advance. You just have to try and anticipate its moves as they're happening, since there's no script to follow for this. The Spider Guardian is just moving as it cares. The big issue is that by the time you can guess where the Spider Guardian is going, it might have already moved past your game plan due to how long it takes to bomb up the tracks to get to the switches to switch the tracks. Especially when failing means redoing the entire puzzle from room 1. The Spider Guardian is a huge sticking point and an otherwise cool concept for power-up bosses. After returning the final light source, the Insect Man tells you that you're on your way to saving the people of Aether, with only one thing standing in your way, the final sanctuary door. In order to get up there, we have to traverse the map hunting down 9 big door keys. There is one light at the end of this tunnel though. We do get to use it doing the light suit, which removes dark Aether damage and allows teleportation through the light network to cut back on the backtracking. For my thoughts on this mechanic, see my previous section on Metroid Prime and the stupid annoyances of the Chozo artifacts. However, once that elongated section is done, another gripe I have with these dumb things is that they're never all that interesting to even find in the first place. Usually the keys are just hiding on a shelf that's 2 rooms farther down than we thought, rather than being surrounded by devious puzzles or additional encounters or more boss fights, but I digress. The keys are in the lock, and the Emperor is found. To be fair to the guy, the Emperor does have a cool design, but his boss battle is again kind of a letdown. The first form isn't too bad. You have to shoot damage into the ball on top of its head while dodging its tentacles it's throwing at you, and you are exposing a half-shielded inner core. You can do this with any weapon, which is really cool that we also have teleporting tentacles to deal with and a huge phase-on encirclement for good measure. It's a long phase, but it's not too bad since the numbers are lowered quite a bit, and dodging isn't all that difficult to figure out. The next phase is where it gets a little bit more interesting. The Emperor recedes into a cocoon form that has to be cracked like an egg, so you spider ball your way up its form and drop bombs in the glowing weak spots. However, you shouldn't run this phase too fast. It's summoning ads constantly, and they're dropping pretty hefty health items. Yeah, this is the part where you should stock up before the real deal comes to town, because this is a huge opportunity. Crack the cocoon and you see the actually cool design of the Emperor overloaded on Aether Energy. This form has nastier attacks, a faster sprint, and a new defense to cover up its shielded eye. It just steals the shielding from Metroid Prime. Yep, its core will flash different colors that'll correspond to what he's weak to at the moment. The final phase, though, is pretty nerve-wracking. The Emperor will start sporting some new summons, charge attacks, projectiles, and a jumping shockwave to mix up what has been a slower encounter as of that point. All the while, you need to watch that core and keep blasting it with whatever flavor of hurt it's up for. It's got the correct difficulty and the health to make it somewhat exciting while not flooring the player in total bullshit. But all the well-designedness in the world isn't going to cover up that it's basically just a giant evil blob monster covered in spikes that Samus never had any real reason to want to shoot in the first place, other than it's obviously giant and evil. With Dark Aether destabilizing, another classic alarm gets triggered and Samus needs to bug out back to Light World. Unfortunately, something unprecedented happens. Something stops her. Yeah, Dark Samus is back for round 3. I actually haven't discussed Dark Samus at all up until this point, and that's for a good reason. In a plot that is so disconnected from Samus herself, Dark Samus is even more disconnected from the plot than that, because there's no good reason why it's hanging around on this particular planet other than it just happened to be Phazon there. It doesn't seem to be planning anything, and Samus never cared to deal with it outside of the times that it attacked her just for standing. Dark Samus is a complete wild card in this scenario, and unfortunately, it came around at the worst possible time. The Dark Samus battles were a cool concept, creating a duplicate of the player character and making them fight it. Dark Samus has corrupted versions of Samus's toolset, and it's surprisingly faster than Samus, making for a hectic, teleporting missile launcher that you're consistently losing track of. The first part of this battle is fairly simple, just keep tabs on the boss and just blast it when you've got the lock. The only hiccup is that its visibility is limited to 1 or 2 visors, as per usual. The final phase is where things get a little bit more confusing, which isn't good since this whole fight is on a countdown, and not a meaningless one either. You figure this out, or you waste valuable time screwing around. But the idea of this phase is that similar to fighting Metroid Prime, where you have to grab Phazon in order to overload Dark Samus, but the only way to get it this time is for you to steal the Phazon Dark Samus is lashing out and redirect it. But only certain attacks. Some others are too big to absorb and therefore have to be dodged. This is not explained well and has to be figured out on the fly, which is a bit unfair since charging up on the enemy's energy blast is unprecedented as a mechanic. Figure it out quick enough and you'll finally be able to get this dogged pursuer off your back and hopefully be rid of it forever. I do appreciate that this game did keep it in canon that Metroid Prime is still your antagonist that stole one of your suits and has been living in it ever since, using the additional Phazon to make it more livable, thereby giving Dark Samus an actual backstory as a monster. So now that is over, sprint as fast as you can to the teleporter and touch base on a fully restored Aether, leaving the dark half completely disintegrated. Samus can get on her ship and finally get back to Federation Society. Echoes was a misfire of a game from a studio that brought us the gold standard, and it seems like the new familiarity with the Metroid series brought on these bad ideas as they were coming up with new ways to challenge the player that in practice were new ways to just antagonize the player from giving us no personal reason to give a shit about Aether's plight, along with incredibly limited NPC interactions that didn't help, along with the lowering interest of the lore by not building interesting locales in the first pair of levels, to the uninteresting antagonists in the Ing, who are beings of pure evil, who are almost mindless the whole time. There were also too many bad gimmicks or outright difficulty spikes that make it hard to see past it to the game's good ideas. because objectively this game is still well built, it's probably around a 7 out of 10, which is really the problem. The Sanctuary level was a great break from the annoyances of the first two, and having interesting puzzles built around all of this incredible machinery was a great idea. Echoes was attempting to be innovative, but in ways that were not player-friendly, and rather than giving us new and exciting features, it gave us a shoddy mess of a mission that had little reason to exist, as in an unfortunate speed bump in Metroid's continued rise to stardom. Hopefully, Retro will be given another chance to right the ship with something meaningful. Another thing worth mentioning here before we end the section is that this is the one and only Metroid game that came with a GoldenEye-style multiplayer mode. An intriguing idea that had comparatively little development spent on it, where you could go to several Aether locations and shoot other Samuses in the face, and you can use the power-ups in the game Mario Kart style to gain advantage over the other players. This idea could work wonders if Retro had more of a focus on it, but considering its lacking appearance ever since, I'm guessing that the team did not care about it. I see potential in multiplayer Metroid if it were ironed out, since Metroid takes place in gimmicky locales, interesting places that could support a quirky multiplayer shooter, along with shifting in and out of Samus's toolset throughout the duels. But alas, this is a feature that just didn't go anywhere. I figured it was worth a mention, maybe boot up your old tiny CD and give it a spin, watch an LP of it. I would say it's worth a 20-minute perusal. At least Retro tried is going to be the tagline of this section. Yes, we are gonna talk about this game too. If you forgot about it, don't worry. Metroid Prime is a 6-game series going on 7, so Nintendo got a lot of use out of it. Hell, half of the games in the Metroid franchise are Prime games, just to show you how deep this goes. This game isn't being done by Retro, it was handed down to Fuse, since they had better things to work on at the time. This game is a bizarre entry, not only due to its genre, but also that Nintendo wanted it done as a serious game. Its marketing call is retelling the grand adventure of Metroid Prime, but in pinball form, which on its face sounds absurd. How do you take a Metroidvania and squish it into a pinball table and do that seriously? Well, as you could tell, a retelling of Prime isn't what you're going to be getting here. It's Prime Pinball as much as pinball can manage, so there's no story, there's little progression, and everything kind of happens randomly. But to be absolutely fair to the probably dead Fuse, as a pinball game on its own, it's probably one of the best you're going to find. This pinball game is pretty high grade for what you would expect in a spin-off game from a completely different genre. There are better ones out there that have denser tables and better features, but Prime Pinball is very solid, since you get to have a minigame or two in the middle of the table, such as the one where Samus does some wall jumping to get one of the artifacts, and you get some power-ups related to the game that does your typical tricks. Gates for the table pit, multipliers, extra balls, and on top of those pinball staples, you also do get to add a couple of power-ups from Prime to your arsenal, which are the bombs and the missiles. The thing that you can use them on, and one of the things that Fuse was most proud of, was this game's 5 boss fights pulled from Prime. Occasionally you get the ability to unmorph Samus and play a few seconds of target shooting on a platform to do some damage to the bosses, and there is where you can use your missiles, and occasionally you can drop morph bombs to dish out extra damage when you're in their arena. It's a nice touch that gives the game an extra flavor and the player some extra damage for some of these hard-ass fights. Being a pinball single-player game, to get through it is unfair and incredibly difficult since you're doing it on a typical amount of limited balls. In order to get through this, you have to complete side objectives to pick up the game's 12 artifacts. Obtuse accomplishments on the boards have to be done on top of all of the game's boss fights. Most of them are pretty fair, considering that you have quite a bit of health for the whole game going into the fights, and the bosses attack so slowly to compensate for your inherent ability problems that it doesn't turn you into a fuck you fest. As long as you can get hard bumper shots on the boss, then they're usually available to get hurt. But then there's Metroid Prime itself, which is terrifying, mostly because its attacks are a lot faster, hit the entire bottom half of the board, and you have to hit the points on its legs before you can hit it in the face for actual damage. which gives you the odd pinball issue where it's demanding you to be an accurate shot on a pinball table, so it ends up feeling like you're trying to predict chaos theory. When you get those opportunities to take those shots, sure, then you can say get good at doing the shots, but those opportunities are handed out at random since you can't predict where the ball's going to go after 2 ricochets. At least the board is designed that if you do get a hard hit on Prime's legs, you do get your ball right back at the bottom bumper. Thankfully, the final phase is not difficult due to its shots getting smaller. Finish off that, and you get to the incredibly weak sauce ending where nothing happens. Prime just explodes, and the credits roll. Considering the amount of effort put in, I'm really surprised that they didn't at least do a mission accomplished screen at the end. For what Prime Pinball is, and how everyone seemed to inherently discount it, I do half-heartedly hold it up as a good spin-off. Sure, the limitations of the pinball game thing, trying to do a single-player narrative game, makes it difficult to finish, but the mechanics are super solid, the maps are faithful to the game, and are somewhat dense with features and nice tracks to get around, and the power-ups are somewhat easy to get, so you can at least get the pit blocks. Multi-ball is notoriously hard to get as per usual, and I appreciate the mini-games being pulled from Prime shooting gameplay to mix up the entire game experience. The boss fights received the attention they needed and were implemented well to match the pinball gameplay, and they did pick the right bosses. The Phazon Soldier, Thardus, and Meta Ridley, even though Meta Ridley's boss fight didn't involve killing Ridley for some reason. If you passed it by for obvious reasons, I would say give it a shot if you have a minute, since Fuse did a remarkable job for putting such a ridiculous concept together at the end of the day. I had a bunch of fun with it when I wasn't dying all the damned time. Now we get to that one game that every Metroid fanboy has never bothered to pick up or acknowledge. Hunters was an odd duck for the series. It's always been that mysterious game in the way back that no one has any clue of what its whole deal is. And it turned out that was for good reason. Hunters seems to be an odd in-betweeny game between the Prime sequels that doesn't do anything for the series. It's simply an adventure Samus went on at one point that has no connection to anything else in the Prime series. So, that tells me that the only reason this game was produced was because Nintendo needed something compelling on the DS. Nintendo wanted to believe in Hunters so badly that they did a pack-in deal for its demo when the DS was coming out. At the start, it sounds like the game will have some potential. Federation HQ intercepts an ancient radio communication that states that the Limbic system has some artifact of unlimited power resting on its planets. Therefore, Samus is contracted out to go and find whatever the hell the message is talking about, and that's pretty much it. You get to the first planet and start poking your beam hand around at things until you run into something odd. Another hunter. Yeah, just like a spaghetti western, a bunch of the other bounty hunters also got the message and are hunting down the same thing. For being the subtitle of the whole damn game, the hunters that Samus has to deal with are definitely the best part about it. They are interesting designs from totally new planets that we haven't seen before, and a couple of them come complete with interesting lore and weapons. Weapons that you pick up as power-ups in the game, and some of these things are damned powerful, reliable sidearms. However, fighting the hunters is a mixed bag. Some of their gimmicks and AI are easy to screw around with and absolutely rip to shreds, and some of the others will be on top of your ass with not much that you can actually do about it. To the point that one of the few times I was killed by a hunter was because I managed to clip through the floor, which in a Nintendo game was a sight I was not expecting. The hunters in the game are also an additional mechanic. If you get killed by them, either by them outskilling you or the game team killing you, the hunter takes one of the items you're hunting in the game and you have to track them down to get it back. But the hunters show up so frequently and randomly that there's a good chance that you'll get your shot at revenge only 2 planets from where you died, so it's not actually that big of a deal. Plus the game's map mechanics make it easy to find where their current location is to go track them down. Another issue with the hunter's mechanic is their random spawning. Since they are so random, you'll sometimes get lumped with a bad arena choice or boss combination and just have to eat crow on that seed until you bring them down. The hunters are across the board piss weak as boss fights go, and dealing with them becomes an annoyance after you've fought them around 4 or 5 times due to their absolutely useless AI. You get access to these weapons and their big splash damage dealers or nice sniper rifles that just baffles you in how anyone could manage to fail using these beast weapons. Another team killer is actually your controls. In comparison to Phantom Hourglass, it isn't so bad, but there are problems when your aiming and movement are tied to dragging around the touchpad. It's not accurate, which it doesn't have to be considering that the game is first person rather than third, but trying to move quickly and reposition on a dime is a fool's errand, which can occasionally be a real kick in the dick when you get caught short on a bad move from the AI that manages to corner you, since doing a 180-degree turn is incredibly slow. Fortunately, the maps are so simplistic in Hunters that doing any platforming with these slipshod controls manages to be kind of a smooth experience just because there's not much of it to do. An issue that'll come up later is that the true level bosses incorporate a lot of target shooting into their gameplay, so dealing with the lazy crosshairs in this game gets to be an ass egg by the halfway mark, especially when you realize that the game is so content deficient that the irritating and half-cocked bosses are being reused, sometimes 3 times copy-pasted. What did the entire budget go to? The 6 enemy hunters that barely serve up a challenge after your second E-tank? Another problem is the attention paid to the game's scan mechanic. This game is trying to be a Prime game, but Nintendo proper is making it and doesn't understand what the scan mechanic's strengths actually were. It isn't enough to just put flavor text on the map. You need to build a world using it, since your typical Metroid game isn't going to slow down to tell you the story, which was why it works in Prime, the stupidly high level of detail. Hunters doesn't have that, and it feels like the lazy student copy version of Prime's scanning, where the details are thin, they barely have anything to do with stuff going on in the Olympic system, and there's not a lot of interesting history or fun facts to be abounded. It does feel like a feature that was slapped on as an obligatory afterthought when the rest of the game was finished. At least the boss fight tips they give you aren't totally useless, even though the weak spots are so obvious that you don't even need them. Likewise, the levels in this game are pretty bad. Due to a lack of world building and detailed maps, they feel like obligatory corridors connected with a handful of idiotic puzzles to break up the straightforward walk with something before getting to the actual boss. The maps aren't dense, they just fill each screen with more enemies, since the lacking Metroidvania elements makes Hunters focus on its more shooting with all these variety of guns that it gives you. The shooting is actually pretty good, and you can develop a working relationship with these weapons, since each one serves a particular role that you'll fall in good line with one of them at the very least. Due to being on the DS, the graphics are limited and get pixelated textures all over the shop that does not help the game become memorable on any level. Everything in this game feels like a shallow imitation of a successful formula done by a studio that just doesn't get what Prime's whole deal is. Prime is meant to be a world that you fully map out and explore and shoot bad aliens in the face, not just a series of completely disconnected arenas. I'm amazed that this game actually did well critically, since overall the game looks like a Prime attempt with about half the effort put in. But then again, that's IGN for you. Hunters is also packaged with a weirdly immense multiplayer mode with a lot more attention put on it than Echoes' attempt. You get access to all of the Hunters as your characters and everything they can do, plus the ability to slot their weapons through pickups along with a few other health and ammo style collectibles that you would assume in a kooky multiplayer shooter. They also give out tons of maps, totaling up to more than 20 of them, and maybe this dual development equally on single and multiplayer is what ended up tanking what could have been a legit Metroid game. Maybe it's the fact that this was on the market around the DS's launch window, which usually doesn't help. At the end of the game, once you finally wrangle the 8 octoliths from 3 copy-pastes of the same boss, you finally get to ascend to the Oubliette, an interdimensional prison built by the super advanced ancient Olympics to house Goria, the antagonist of the game. One not seen before the ending level of the game, which is always a recipe for success. Yeah, if you thought that ultimate power plot hook at the start was going anywhere, you predicted right when you thought that it sounded like bullshit. It was actually a message sent by Goria in order to lure dinguses into freeing it from its eternal hell. The Oubliette is a ship that the Olympics exiled to a place in between dimensions that has been holding it for eternity since Goria has the ability to absorb weapons that are used against it, and it was using its immense powers to raise every Olympic planet civilization. This was the one place that they could put Goria, and he does not live up to his own hype for a game of this caliber. Similar to Metroid Prime, you need to cycle through your 6 weapons during the boss fight to get good damage, which in typical fashion. Fantastic when you get a good weakness, terrible when the bad ones come up, so it's a mixed bag boss fight every time. You need to defeat parts of its body to open up its weak spot and then shoot that. So it's another dull health sponge boss to finish out another game. Or so you would think. If you don't do something during the battle, you get a substandard ending cutscene after Goria is defeated that feels incomplete, and that's because it is. If you fight it naturally, you get the neutral ending. To get the good one, you have to solve a panel order puzzle using some previous lore during the boss fight, which will force Goria to open up a portal once it's defeated in order to access its dying form and permanently kill it. Because all of that is a normal thing that players would absolutely do. The second form is pathetic. Similar to Metroid Prime, this is another one of those rainbow beam moments where you grab the final weapon specifically for this only time in the game and lazily blast it at the boss until full defeat. Why did they gatekeep this form of all things in this game? It's not intimidating or even interesting to look at. But if you do it, you do get to see the Save the Galaxy screen and show that Samus managed to escape the Olympic system. This game is absolutely substandard for what I thought Nintendo would have thought acceptable. A game that really wants to be its big brother but has none of the expertise to fulfill its ambitions. This game did not try enough, and it's appropriate that many Metroid fanboys decided to skip it. It's clearly not worth their attention, and while the hunters and their attached mechanics do make for some potential in concept, in practice, they are an embarrassing set of warriors who seem to have killed themselves with their own incompetence just a little into the game. Their gimmicks don't save them if they fail to shoot Samus 40% of the time. Hell, I remember getting killed in equal time by the floor glitching on me than the hunters themselves. The boss fights are terrible, the exploration is shallow, the world building is dreadful, and the plotline of this game is so threadbare that you could predict the plot twist by the end of the intro cutscene. I am amazed that this got anything resembling a 9 out of 10, but maybe this was somehow the golden eye of the DS days that I wasn't aware of. In my experience, this is about as half-cocked of a Metroidvania as you can get, and it's embarrassing that it's attached itself to the Prime brand at all for what we ended up getting out of it. And lo and behold, we get to the end of the mainline Prime games, as much as I hate saying that stupid term. This was the big thrust of Prime onto the Wii during its launch window to try and legitimize Wiimote wiggling as a new form of gameplay. Thankfully, this entire game was also where the series plot got back on track after going off kilter in Echoes, since that was a major blow toward the enjoyment of the sequel. They also ditched the multiplayer angle for the series, since I'm guessing Nintendo's audience wasn't exactly biting on that innovation after Hunters flopped super hard. But what we did get was yet another example of why the Wii should have been the hangout for orphaned FPSs instead of the haven of shovelware that it became, since Prime's gameplay perfectly suits a remote-based control scheme due to not only the ease of waving crosshairs all over the screen, switching weapons and visors, while also intuitively moving around and strafing. Corruption also doubles down on Prime's gameplay model by adding in a couple of new features. Throughout the game, Samus does get the occasional ability to utilize her ship in actual gameplay by having it do a handful of contextual quest-related things, such as doing an artillery barrage on specific targets. Hand in hand with the game's expanded map design, you can also use the ship to move around a save point or exit vehicle in several areas. This leads to a weird scenario where one of the new collectibles in this game are expanded the weapon capacity of your ship's missiles, which are only used in plot-based objectives, so that concept is a real head-scratcher. The game also allows you to stack your weapon upgrades like Super Metroid, such as gaining the ability to shoot through X-ray scoped walls using your Nova Beam. This feature isn't used all that often, but it is nice to see Retro continuing to adapt their core gameplay to be more effective and player-friendly. Corruption is the most solid form of the Prime gameplay model seen in the series, and the new bells and whistles are nice advancements that give some good wrinkles and puzzle elements to a game, and help make Corruption feel like its own thing, even if the game's plot already serves to mix up how weird it is. After the mission on Echoes, Samus returns to Federation HQ to pick up another mission, since bounty hunters in this universe don't know what their job means. While on board a Federation ship, she also meets 3 other hunters, the one idea that Hunters brought to the table of the main series. And rather than what Hunters did, Corruptions uses the idea to add more characters to its game's story. This being the one break in Prime where there's other people involved in Samus's mission, and while these guys don't stick around, I do like that Metroid is trying to break out of its comfort shell and bringing us a more traditional FPS campaign. It's just that the narrative is a little undercooked. The 3 hunters are great characters, bringing their own personality, gimmicks, and combat styles to make them unique as a gang of hunters from the previous game. The bounty hunters are tasked by the Aurora unit, the Federation's supercomputer that they use to control large military complexes such as the flagship that you're standing on. The mission is to go down to a planet in order to deal with the space pirate uprising. The planet's defenses are offline, so the team needs to go deal with that. During this mission, we get to see Prime's new direction and sharp focus, as you'll get more communications with infield soldiers and the rest of your team as you interact to help circumvent the space pirates on your way to accomplishing your objectives and get the complex back up and running. There's more cutscenes, there's more dialogue, while also keeping that Prime focus on puzzle solving and explorative gameplay. Corruption feels more or less like Prime with more story put on top of it, which is going to depend on your taste. During the ending parts of the mission, Samus also gets a quick run-in with Ridley, having survived on Talon 4 and having his cybernetics repaired by his old friends. The shaft drop boss fight is an interesting spin on a boss battle that turns the gameplay on its head, since the fight is done vertically, and the amount of time that you have left before smashing into the ground is a timer, but it's also completely useless. The presentation is what makes it exciting, since it's not a hard encounter by any means due to how vulnerable Ridley is constantly. However, soon after that battle is completed and the 2 escape their death drop, Samus's team manages to complete their objective and destroy an incoming impact event caused by the invasion. However, an old friend manages to appear while the team is together and heavily wounds all of them. Since we were talking about Samus's ship, we should talk about the Wii implementation stuff in Corruption. This was released early enough in the Wii's history that Nintendo still wanted their games to show off what the Wii could do, and thankfully Retro didn't use it too much. But you get to see it when Samus flies between planets and to use her actual hand to control the ship. It's not much, like you can check the ammo stock in the ship and you can bring up the ship's password entry and the planet map. Along with this, frequently you'll also be doing a variety of odd door opening by using the Wiimote to open levers. It's about as immersive as throwing a hammer through the television, but the gimmick isn't intrusive and it works most of the time. It's just a dumb additional button press you have to do, since the Wiimote is pretending to put you in the shoes of Samus when it's actually doing is wasting your time. This is the point in the game where we're introduced to the titular feature of Corruption. While the members of Samus's team have disappeared after the incident, Samus was dragged back to Federation Military Hospital and was treated for a permanent phase-on corruption that her team acquired during the Dark Samus attack. Thankfully, technology was being studied that saved her life at the time. Her suit has been equipped with a PED, a phase-on control unit that the soldiers have now been using to buff up their weapons. Samus now acquires the same ability to dump energy from her health bar into the unit in order to shoot phase-on rounds for short periods. However, you can't use this feature for too long, otherwise the power overloads and starts dealing damage to Samus. It is a nice feature that's only going to be used for the hard boss fights or any enemy you just hate the look of too much. After this, Samus gets her mission for the rest of the game. Similar to Norian, 3 other planets in the solar system have also been struck with Leviathan seeds and have been destroyed. Samus needs to go to all of them and destroy the seeds for galactic peace. On the planet, she'll have to improvise a tactical plan to access each seed, since they're all shielded in order to deal the final blow. Thankfully, these problems that face Samus getting to the seed makes each level special and keeps the game fresh, as these multiple capture objectives tend to make the game more tedious if the way to get to the ultimate battle in the level are all the same. One involves infiltrating through the shield, one has you blow up the shield. There's different ways to do this, and some levels have you stay on the planet the entire time, and some have you backtrack, so there's good variety to the campaign path. One major change from previous Prime games is the obvious fact that it feels more mission-based due to the game being set on multiple planets, and each have a limited facility map and no exploration beyond its borders. You're going to be exploring several square miles of a planet rather than the entire planet. The levels in this game are a lot better than Echo's, Brio being the weakest of the 3, being a kind of cyberpunk-esque ancient ruin crossed with a forest, kind of like the Chozo ruins of Talon 4, but not with the great pseudo-religious lore that made the Chozo ruins really work. The Space Pirate planet is a lot harder with a consistent acid rain effect for a lot of the level, but it's very mechanical, a large sprawling facility which works well in Metroid games, since it involves a lot of puzzle and intricate moving around within the facility that makes the trek interesting to figure out. And then there's Elysia, the current best level in the Prime series. It's a technological marvel similar to Twilight Princess's City in the Sky, where it's super ancient, advanced, abandoned technology that does a bunch of kooky, weird stuff, such as some of the automaton bosses and enemies being steam-powered. While all the levels are similar in size to Echoes' worlds, through a combination of better lore writing, more collectibles to be found, and having to double back to the worlds for multiple objectives, they managed to make these levels feel a lot more dense and immersive, helped out by the multiple landing zones and better shortcut features, along with an incredibly detailed 3D map that is a great aid to Samus getting around overall. The collectibles are only barely needed in this game. Due to the better control scheme leading into the game's total design, Corruption is an easier game in comparison to its earlier titles. The encounters are easier, but they are varied. They have great gimmicks, and they're interesting beasts and monsters. It's a colorful rogues gallery, and it keeps the game very fresh, which is a must in Metroidvania. The issue is that there are a couple stinky farts interwoven in the rogues gallery. Unfortunately, one of the few level end bosses is a notorious flop of a mess. Majinar, whose battle gimmick serves to slow the fight down to an infuriating crawl, but there's definitely more hits here than misses. Even the acid rain level isn't a difficulty spike, since rather than Echoes' constant damage mechanic, the acid rain is limited to the outdoors, so the challenge is in figuring out where you can cover, is rather than dealing with temporary safe zones, and that's a massive improvement. And speaking of such, Corruption brings back the excellent scan visor that was missing from Echoes due to the dull conflict of that game. While it's not as great as the originals, Corruption does have a better story to tell through its flavor text, since the planets, the enemies, and the conflict with Dark Samus all have better stakes and a history to study. They even bring back the fictitious measurements, just like Prime. There's tons of it to explore. Scanning is interwoven into the gameplay, and getting you experience Elysium's abandonment and the Space Pirates' delusions through their journal entries is great, especially since Corruption brought back the 100% categories from Echoes, which was one of Retro's better ideas to liven up their scanning idea. It's Prime's scanning mechanic with the improvements from Echoes, the best of both. Another great move was the inevitable Hunter's boss fights with the team members that went crazy. Basically, they couldn't handle the phase on Corruption, and it got the better of all of them. Their boss battles are some of the best, since you get some build up to their battles, you get some character interactions, and even dialogue during the boss battle itself. It's the full package that every great boss fight should have, and you get that great learning about the boss through the level entirely rather than all right before it in an intro cutscene, to the point that Gandreda used her transformation ability to get the drop on Samus right before the fight. A plot point that worked out really well, since even though objectively it's completely obvious that it's her, considering there's only one person in that entire planet that's alive, Her fight is so late in the game that you forget about her long enough that it does actually catch you off guard when it does happen. Plus, I appreciate seeing Gore punching the shit out of Samus's ship on Elysia. It's the comedy equivalent of Samus getting hit in the head with one of Thardus's rocks from the original game. After defeating a Leviathan boss, Samus also acquires a new power-up. They're all Phazon based and all markedly useless. Since they are all hyper mode abilities, they don't come into play all that much due to the health cost of using them, and while they do super heavy damage, the attacks aren't all that effective at all. Hyper Ball does some AoE damage while you roll into enemies, Hyper Missile does Phazon splash damage, and Hyper Grapple is doing hyper damage to one enemy. Pretty underwhelming, but an interesting thing does occur while this progresses. Similar to the earlier games, Retro did add in the feature where you can see Samus's eyes on the UI while doing things in the game. Through these check-ins with Samus, you actually see in her eyes the corruption throughout the game, which is a super nice immersive detail that shows that Retro is more committed to their development than their peers. Once all three Leviathans are defeated, the way to Phase can be found on board the Valhalla. The Valhalla is a derelict Federation ship that was torn apart by a space pirate raid and has been available throughout the entire game, but can't be completed until the space pirate level is finished. That's because this game also has a Chozo artifact feature, but this time it's the batteries for the ship that you have to find. Like the others, you get the hints on where to find it from the ship, but that's not actually the cool part. The cool part is that the Valhalla is Nintendo's attempt at a spooky level. It's an abandoned ship where the crew has been killed. You do see Federation soldier and space pirate corpses, and later when you discover another hidden lab, you also get accosted by Metroids here. The entire ship is dark, entirely broken, and you get attacked by spontaneous aliens. Like Fusion, is not actually scary at all, but it does have some interesting horror ambience that makes the level at least fun to walk through. It's the equivalent of a try-hard haunted house at your local amusement park. Not scary, but appreciated in its own weird way. Once you slot in all the batteries, you get access to the ship's leftover computer, which gives you some information that can unlock a wormhole to get you to the planet Phase, the origination point for all of Phazon, and somewhere we can finally cut off this corrupting force of the universe for good. The Federation plan is an entire invasion fleet to head there, which means that she's going to be by herself for the entire ride down to the final boss. Fortunately, Phase is like the Talon 4 core, but without the difficulty and obtuse platforming. As you could imagine, once you get down to Phase, because the entire planet is a sentient being made of pure Phazon, Samus's corruption goes into overdrive, putting you in a permanent hyper mode where you will die if you overload in that mode. Taking damage increases it, but there are frequent pickups that reduce it, plus you get permanent access to all of those dumb hyper mode abilities, so you can get some legit use out of them finally. Surprisingly, the jaunt down to Phase is pretty short, and the enemies found there are actually easy to kill. An additional surprise is that when you get down to Phase's core, you still fight Dark Samus in permanent hyper mode, which means that this is the final boss of the game, but done in a permanent Rainbow Beam-esque state. Another oddity is that you can reduce the hyper mode overload by constantly firing your gun to keep it in check, so if the final boss isn't doing constant damage, this is one of the easiest boss fights in the whole game. I don't think I ever got above life half bar during my first attempt at it. For being our final run-in with the most evolved Metroid Prime ever, what they produced is disappointing because you never get a hard reason from the game why any of this is happening at all. They never directly tell you, but you can infer what's going on from who the boss fight is. Dark Samus is the ultimate evolved form of Metroid Prime, the only Metroid Prime that survives since there are corpses of other Primes laying around Phase. Metroid Prime is a being of purest Phazon evolution, so Phase would be its home. In order to further its plan of universal corruption, at some point Dark Samus stole and installed an Aurora unit into the sentient planet, which allowed it to supercharge itself and firing Leviathan seeds faster to corrupt more worlds, as what was happening throughout corruption. Samus has to shoot both things involved in the face to save the entire universe. If that was more explicit, then this boss fight might have been improved a bit instead of feeling completely random and out of left field. Overall, Corruption was the game that most tried to mix in a traditional FPS campaign into a Metroidvania, and for the most part it works out pretty well, adding in some more story beats, characters, and plot progression cutscenes that weren't in the previous two Primes, while also keeping the core focus of Prime scanning, shooting prowess, and upgrade collection intact. At some points, the focus on story does take away from the strengths of a Metroidvania, but I consider those losses to at least be a passable problem. Some of the backtracking can get annoying. I do wish we had spent more time developing the hunter characters throughout the game before they got lost by the corruption, but they do still make for great boss fights. The Rogues Gallery in this game is the usual level of vibrant compared to previous Prime games, with interesting gimmicks and different feeling boss battles. Although, again, some of them do suck trash cans. Corruption is also one of the easiest Metroid games to date, which is made up for somewhat by the strengths of the narrative, but even still, it's just way too easy. It hampers the feeling of leveling up through the Metroidvania, even if the multiple planets idea didn't already do that, since you can't revisit the earlier parts of the game. There's just nothing there for you. Ultimately, it tried to mix up the Prime formula with some new ideas, and for the most part, the new stuff works out and complements the core formula of the series, and I appreciate Retro's continuing ingenuity. Hopefully, when the Vaporware gets off Metroid Prime 4, we'll be able to see if that they can still walk the walk. Oh yeah, I think there was another Wii Metroid game that I kind of forgot about. Oh, which one was that? Which one was it? Oh, yeah. It's you. So I guess we get to stop having fun and talk about Team Ninja's attempt at making a Metroid game. Well, not just Team Ninja. This one was actually a bizarre collaboration called Project M, consisting of Team Ninja, Nintendo, and a little bit of Koei Tecmo. The animators were called D-Rockets, but the problems of the game aren't their fault since they were just told what to draw to support what they were doing. I'm pretty sure they weren't the ones that were casting the game. So, Other M is the derided game that people want to actively abandon, which is a shame since, putting my cards on the table right now, conceptually, Other M could have been the most interesting Metroid game to date, since its premise was a good one. The issue with Other M is that when they needed to plan out the game from that premise, everything they implemented to make the game was the wrong idea they could have picked. I have not seen a game in a long time that had so many wrong ideas put into it, and no one stopped to double check any of it. At the very least, Other M was an ambitious project, but that collaborative nature of it might have been a contributing factor to how everything went wrong. The team might have just been too big. Okay, so why could Other M have worked? It's pretty simple. While Samus has always been a silent protagonist, just like Link, there is no in-universe reason why she needs to be one. She could be a full character in her own right. The big reason why she's purely silent is vaguely related to being raised by pseudo-religious giant birds, which again, as far as we know, doesn't cause her silence. She can be a character, and trying to do that was something I applaud as a premise, as an idea. Let's give Samus a personality and a backstory and see what we can get out of that. The problem was that all the stuff that was added to her in Other M was god-awful. Just fucking dreadful, ridiculously bad. Which is still amazing to me that it's so bad, because this game is overstuffed with dialogue. There's tons and tons of text in this game, and it is such a consistent train wreck that I don't even know how this happened. How do you write this much text into a game that previously never had this much of a script, and all of it sucks? It would be something if the backstory of her in the army was bad, but the military platoon characters were good. If it was a mixed bag, it would make more sense, but everything being terrible is something I just don't understand. Again, there was promise in the backstory that they planned. Samus joins up with the Federation army, but she's a brat that doesn't follow orders, doesn't follow the rules, and gets the attention of the upper brats training her, and then in the mission, the person she runs into is her old mentor. That's a solid starting idea, but then they add in this pseudo-father figure relationship that was developed, and that her disrespect towards the chain of command was something that was seen as an adorable quirk rather than something intolerable, is one of the many weird things that undermine what could have been a great starting point for her character. Then a mission she was on with her platoon went screwy, and the stress of that caused her to abandon the group and completely disappear. Later, she returns to the Federation with her skill set, and eventually would go on this mission to run into her old mentor and possibly confront her broken relationship and the baggage of running away from her platoon. This is all excellent ideas, but when it came to the final product, all of this fell apart. The immediate reason is that they casted the exact wrong person to play Samus. Samus's voice actor is startlingly bad for something this important of a character. She is deadpan the whole way through, can't give any emotion or inflection to her performance, and doesn't put the emphasis on where it needs to be. The more leering reason is the terrible, god-awful script. Even if Samus's actor had been a professional, the script is still asinine, with dialogue lines not being structured correctly to build drama, suspense, or mystery, and can't establish this new backstory and character relationship. A lot of these establishing shots are done in flashbacks, which would be fine if they weren't being fired off in a random manner. Plus, the script doesn't write Samus in a way that makes any sort of logical sense to where Other M is on the timeline. This might have worked 10% better if Other M was billed as a prequel mission, one of Samus's first missions, but Other M is taking place at least halfway through the franchise, which means that Samus has at least been on 4 galaxy-saving missions by this point in the games, and an even more extensive career than that in the manga series. It does not make any goddamn sense that a person with her experience would be so passive and so meek in the company of less accomplished soldiers. You could say that she talks this way with her old commandos due to the broken relationship and her camaraderie with them if you showed a backstory that matched this behavior, but likewise Other M doesn't have any of that included, therefore the behavior has no logical basis. Another highlighted moment of what the fuckery is in the back half of the game when we encounter a pseudo Ridley. It's not really Ridley, it's kind of a clone, and they instill a PTSD angle with Samus and Ridley, stemming from her encountering him as a tiny child and possibly killed her family. But there's a couple of problems with this. One, it shouldn't have been added at all due to Samus and Ridley having more history between those two events, that it shouldn't have affected her all that much. And two, even though it's in Other M, it doesn't affect anything on the boss battle that comes after it. She's not unwilling to fight Ridley in the slightest, and gets over the scared factor immediately, so what was the point of showing that at all? Pretty much all of the character details Samus gets in Other M is totally made up for this game specifically, so you could just start removing things entirely. Not all of these details need to make it into this game. Another major criticism that could have worked stemming from Samus's added personality, and look, I'm fine with Samus being a little wooden as a character and speaking unemotionally. For all of the criticisms that Other M is, the one thing that caused all these problems is not 100% true. If you look at the dialogue in Fusion, which is canonical Samus talking, it does match up to her script in Other M, so her unemotional way of seeing things is pre-established. But you can still use that to build a character that grows from an unemotional start, especially since characters that she knows on a deep level die in this game. That did not happen here, but what did happen is that Samus decided to fall back into the mentor-mentee relationship once Adam, a properly established character in the Metroid canon by the by, allowed her to help them on their mission. Adam said that the condition is that she follows his orders to the letter, and the reason given is that she still has access to her power bombs, which are incredibly dangerous explosives, so she needs to have her power-ups authorized by him before use. Now, this is a plot point that I could actually accept, since you don't want Samus running around with her whole toolkit if it has the possibility of causing friendly fire and blowing up large sections of the ship while it's in space. The obvious fucking problem that everyone is already yelling at me about through this is that they take this authorization idea way too fucking far, to the point where it's nonsensical due to A, Samus should have some pushback about this authorization stuff, since again, she shouldn't be this fragile and meek as a character, and B, there's no logical reason why Samus should be following this stupid condition. Adam can't exactly force her to leave the ship and go away, take her off the mission. She's not even related to the army. So there's no consequences to Samus if she disobeys, which she should on a couple of her power-ups. Her powered up missiles and beams, I could see being good ideas for authorization, especially since she had access to previous beams that could shoot through walls, again, probably being a huge fucking team-killing problem. But her additional suits and the grapple beam, the speed booster, and eventually this leads us to the late game level and the cutscene that everyone remembers, where Samus enters the lava-filled portion of the ship, and she isn't authorized to use her Varia suit to protect her from the extreme heat until the level's boss battle, which is so insanely stupid that it by itself brought the entire franchise down by probably 1 star at least. It's such an incredibly, impressively moronic plot point in the game that I can't even describe it because it makes no sense on any level. The central premise of this order by Adam was that Samus's weapons could inadvertently hurt his unit if she went out in full force. What effect does wearing PPE have on that idea? It's literally doing the opposite thing to what Adam was afraid of. It's a power-up designed specifically to protect Samus instead of hurting things around her. If you wanted to do it this way, then your better bet would have been giving Samus her weapons but nothing else, and have her find those power-ups on the scene, so you could have both ideas in the game, even though, again, that's not a perfect solution, and it would also look really stupid. Another huge motherfucking problem for Other M's plot is that it attempts to have these mystery elements, but since it's an incompetent script, the mysteries don't go anywhere or matter in the grand scheme of things. Mysteries like the little bird creature that Samus sees early on, the mystery is that it's actually the pre-evolved form of Ridley, and that's it. Then there's the mystery of a lurking NPC called Madeline Bergman. Samus meets her partway through the story and gets some details about the disaster of the bottle ship, that it was dealing in bioweapons, so the entire ship was a secret lab working on recreating space pirates without Mother Brain. Therefore, the experiments went feral. A lot later, we run into her again, and she confirms that due to the samples that the Federation were able to take from Samus's run-ins with the creatures, they have also begun working on cloning new unfreezable Metroids and Ridley for some reason. Madeline confirms that the Federation did try to recreate their own version of Mother Brain as well, to serve as the linchpin for this entire plan to basically recreate every single bad thing that Samus has ever killed. In the endgame bits, Samus eventually runs into a second NPC also calling herself Madeline Bergman. She reveals that she was working on the Mother Brain project and that the Madeline that Samus has actually been saving is the project. The created Mother Brain that was hidden so carefully that even her given name, Melissa Bergman, is also MB initials. The Federation attempted to build a new Mother Brain that would create a maternal bonding relationship with the Metroids a la Samus's baby Metroid, but when the MB started to become self-aware and grew extreme distrust about the experiment, the higher-ups planned to alter her AI to be more obedient, which is when she overthrew her masters, activating the new space pirates to destroy the facility, which ended up destroying everything. You start to see that this mystery is shite because the story interlinking the reveals is full of the biggest morons ever committed to paper. Like, these are the exact dumbasses that ran the Umbrella Corporation into the ground, except on a galactic scale. Instead of making a bunch of bioweapons, the Federation managed to recreate the entire space pirate society because of their bullshit reasons, and they ended up completely destroying everything and being a galactic threat. MB could have had some sort of redemption as a ridiculous final boss, which with their inclusion of Phantoon as the secret boss, shows that they have the ability to make huge terrifying bosses, but we didn't get that since Other M sticks to its narrative guns. The final cutscene of the game is Samus using the game's investigation mechanic to call the shot for someone else to kill MB, and then the Federation's goons take control of the bottle ship recovery operation away from Samus. Because we couldn't have a revival of a classic Metroid beastie, even though we designed him for the intro cutscene. We'll just keep Mother Brain, which is a mother brain, as a regular person for the whole game instead of a crazy cybernetic dinosaur or literally anything else. The game's other big mystery is the role of the so-called Deleter, a cool alias if a bunch of voice actors didn't sound like non-functioning computers. It sounds like a great idea on paper. At a point in the game, we start discovering evidence of a sabotage on the bottle ship, but no one else could get on it without the team knowing, which means someone on board isn't saying everything, which works since it's a big Federation conspiracy to hide their involvement by destroying the ship and killing all of the witnesses. Throughout the game, the Deleter would cap off the platoon members one by one as Samus would find clues to the Federation's involvement and keep in contact with the platoon and get to know each member again in order to suss out who actually did it. Then confront them with the evidence and eventually end in a Hunters-esque boss battle with a bunch of mechanics as he fails to kill Adam or blow up the bottle ship. Instead, the mystery of the game is legitimately unfinished. They forgot to put the denouement in, which is a new level of incompetency. We do get some clues. We get to see the Deleter kill some platoon members, and even at one point having a boss fight with the Deleter while he drives around a souped up forklift. But then the Deleter ends up dying off screen without confirming his involvement while the actual antagonist overtakes his role. If the Deleter thing was more of a main plot element instead of a side story and something that was interwoven into the bigger game progression, we could have gotten something exciting out of it instead of it being this loose plot thread that doesn't go anywhere. It's not a stupid idea, it's stupid that no one bothered to write that idea to go anywhere. Since we're here, let's talk about that investigation idea again. This could have been a cool spin on the Prime scanning mechanic. You get some clues and use them to add context to the mystery or get closer to an objective. But no, usually they're dumb shit obvious or have no bearing on the story whatsoever. Plus, the bigger problem is that some of this stuff that you're supposed to be investigating is so impossible to find that it's adventure game level absurd. To the point where one thing you're supposed to find is a green blood splatter on some grass. Then there's stuff like a hole in the wall or a logo of the Federation, which are somehow important. Plus, the hints they give you are either too vague or non-existent to help you differentiate what dumb little thing in the room you're trying to find. The idea needed to clean up its indications to make this work, since in practice, these investigation segments turn into Where's Waldo without the Waldo. And since we're talking about this feature, let's talk about the controls because, oh boy, Other M just didn't get anything right. In spite of having 3 game studios involved, apparently no person on the Project M team sat down and said to themselves, why are we using the D-pad for this? To bring back some of that old SNES nostalgia, I guess? Project M decided that to control Samus on the Wii, players would be using the Wiimote's D-pad instead of something else, something on a ubiquitous add-on to the Wii that literally every player would have because its usage is required for 70% of Wii games, something that has 2 buttons on it, something that has something else on it that might stand out. Oh yeah, the nunchuck! Apparently Nintendo forgot that existed because I don't know what level of brainlessness you have to be operating with to think that a D-pad for 3D space is remotely acceptable for any game after Crash Bandicoot 1. Controlling Samus in this game feels like you're controlling a malfunctioning RC helicopter, which is even more infuriating when you have to accomplish speed booster / shine spark sections where precise control is expected. And then there's the game's camera, an entire lack of control. Playing Other M feels absurd when you can't turn the camera to see where you're going, and I end up running sideways through hallways or toward the camera where I can't see. Having to spend big amounts of this game having no visibility on where I'm going. It's great that this game also had useless collectibles because forget about finding them using these half-assed control maps that you can't change. A small way that the game says fuck you is that the missiles are a lot easier to reload, so the missile pickups in this game are single missiles instead of 5 per. On top of the movement controls being literal ass, like you have to control this game better if you shove the Wiimote up your butt, is the dual control where you have to flip the Wiimote around and point it at the screen to do any accurate shooting. You could probably see the issue this would cause a mile away, where the Wii would have issues detecting whether or not the Wiimote was pointed at the screen. It's not super common, but considering that was even a possibility, I don't know why pointing the Wiimote was what you would use to make that transition, since two common Wiimote buttons aren't even put in use due to the forgetfulness of the nunchuck. A decent addition to the combat is that the finishing moves are animated pretty well, especially in Other M's boss battles. They can get kind of intense, but the issue is that the regular enemies have so much health or are difficult to take down that you aren't going to be able to use them that often, plus the staggers that you have to get to even use the takedown move is so randomly long in a firefight that there's a good chance that once you run over to get the move, since you have to use it in proximity to a downed enemy, that the enemy will just get up and smack you for a bunch of damage. I remember getting hurt a lot in Other M from regular enemy mobs due to the absurd game controls. Other M does have an odd feature where you can reload missiles and health from red bar zone by holding down the Wiimote, which is great when it's dead silent. Not so much in a firefight, so you better hope you never take a lot of damage or that feature is pretty useless. Other M has many problems. So many that I probably forgot some, but to be honest, there are a couple things that it does right, and both have to relate to Other M's good use of nostalgia. Just like Dread, which we'll talk about soon, Other M brings everyone to the party. You get all of the old Super Metroid power-ups, Speed Booster, Grapple Beam, Screw Attack, Gravity Suit, Plasma Beam, and Seeker Missile. A lot of it is back, but not in the best shade due to the aforementioned everything problem. Furthermore, the boss gallery is stronger than what I was expecting. The first half of the game is pretty typical Metroid, a bunch of creatures similar to the regular enemies but bigger, some unknown aliens defeated by the power-up du jour, with a shout out going to the two lava monsters for having some elaborate final kills and good battle mechanics. The back half is where things get fun though, as we run into old favorites. The Queen Metroid returns, Ridley and Nightmare come back, and the aforementioned Phantoon. We even get a couple of mini encounters like space pirates back in the good old days. At least these additions to their appearance list was done with some actual respect and their appropriate challenges, and they follow their gimmicks from their previous games. The boss fights in Other M were pretty good. Since the team focused on dialing in the combat, which did them some favors, it's challenging, the finishers are impactful, and they flow pretty well. Plus, the regular control problems are lessened because it seems like they designed the boss fights around them to kind of mitigate a lot of the issues with the bad control scheme. While a lot of the dialogue in this game and character interactions don't go anywhere due to the narrative being structured like a house of cards built by a drunk, one particular scene is more infamous than the others, where Samus discovers the unkillable nature of the bred Metroids on the bottle ship and goes in for the self-sacrifice on Section 0. Adam decides to get off of his commander's ass and head down to that section as well to confront Samus. Adam shoots her in the back to do the self-sacrifice himself after an attempted sad scene from Samus to convince him otherwise. Using logic to defeat her argument, Samus is given the mission to destroy Ridley while he destroys the unkillable Metroids by running in and jettisoning the entire section and crashing it into a planet. The entire scene is half-cocked from a bad script trying to establish the emotions of the moment and failing, there being no build-up with Adam to make the audience care about his demise, and the obtuse way they went about doing this in the first place, with Adam making the decision and putting Samus in a position where she couldn't tell him off about it, or accept his rationality, or just any way to tie the scene together to be the dramatic send-off they were trying to make it. It's another scene in a vast collection of scenes that attempts profundity and comes across like a drama project by a second-year college student. Same with the kooky character scenes with Samus' sassy black friend who managed to survive all of the bullshit of the game through the power of his giant guns. This attitude towards constantly sidelining Samus' ability to do anything is reflected in the game's ending, where she doesn't even get the opportunity to kill MB. Some random jackoffs just burst into the room at that moment and do it for her, and then the Colonel thanks her for her work she's done and immediately tells her to fuck off. She's an unauthorized bounty hunter and therefore must be escorted off the premises so that the trustworthy Federation can retire the bottle ship, definitely 100%. There are innumerable problems with Other M, and all of them are legitimate issues that should have been ironed out, and it adds up to one of the worst games in Nintendo's showcase, especially for being one from 2012. But ultimately, there is a universe out there, in a rare amount of universes, where Other M could have been the defining game for the franchise for the right reasons. Expanding Samus's character by giving her these pre-bounty hunter days, army relationships, and making Adam an important character in her backstory years, but that would require a page 1 rewrite of this entire game, redoing everything from scratch due to the innumerable problems where almost everything in the game was a bad idea. There is a universe where the Other M project could have worked, but unfortunately that's not the one that we ended up in. I have no fucking clue how 3 studios compounded together and could come together to produce something so obviously deficient from any set of standards that it was allowed to be greenlit and rushed to print with a smile from everybody's face. Hopefully we'll never see the likes of these designers' ideas ever again for Metroid, but someone should take a second crack at rebooting Samus's backstory and bring in a performer that could redefine Samus's character. Someone better than these planks that they managed to hire. Out of the studios' collective experience and heartfelt ambitions to make the best Metroid, we get this unbelievable Dread is truly amazing. So yeah, Metroid had a few rough years under Nintendo around Other M because several years later, we also got a 3DS thingamajig called Federation Force flying the Prime flag. I don't know how this was billed at the time, but I'm going to imagine that when people saw that the next major Metroid game turned out to be a chibi game that you pilot giant robot mechs instead of the main character Samus, there were probably some eyebrows being raised. I'm not sure why this game was greenlit by Nintendo, since it seems like such an odd remixing of the Metroid brand after the major disappointment of Other M. Nintendo should have put this on the back burner and tried to come up with a better follow-up to show that the series ship could be righted instead of putting out a non-Samus Metroid game involving the nobodies from the Federation Army going on mission-based campaign in a multiplayer-focused game. This entry is very odd for when it was released back in the early 2010s. Federation Force was an attempt to get a more gimmicky, multiplayer-focused entry onto the 3DS that could handle that sort of game because this game's campaign does not have a good vision and somehow serves to be more derivative than Hunters from a few years ago. Seems like that should have been obvious since, again, the main character isn't Samus, so the plot of the franchise doesn't go anywhere, and likewise, the missions and objectives in this game aren't great. It feels like the most arena of Metroid's arena shooters, since the missions you're going on sound like typical COD stuff from any other FPS, where you head down to planets to destroy munitions factories, steal raw materials from invaded mines, and defend data extraction points. To be fair, this game does have a lot of variety in the gameplay you get, since you'll be out of your mech suit a couple of missions in the game, and likewise they are the worst parts of the game, since you end up being stupidly vulnerable to any damage. You get to push incredibly slow minecarts around, you get to do a couple copy-pasted boss fights with the most generic enemies in the world, and then shoot pinballs up a hill or carry them to your ship. Federation Force has a lot of gameplay variety in the campaign, but a whole bunch of it is boring and sometimes doesn't even work all that well. Plus, the game's connection to Prime is as ghostly as ever. Clearly, the plot itself has no implications for the Prime series. This is a side story of a side story, where the entire plot revolves around the space pirates building some random doomsday weapon that'll just get blown up the instant Samus sees it. Most of the missions are either gathering intel on it, stealing its energy or components, or just destroying some space pirate facilities at random, which makes it laughable when you start getting to see Prime journal entries in this game. And it ends up being even more threadbare than when Hunters tried to toe this line, but made about 7 years after that game and therefore not having any excuse. The art style of this game is also an incredibly weird choice. Why the hell did they go chibi with it? It's not as cute as what I'm sure the central designer bet on it being, and it gets in the way of the actual story since you can't actually tell what scale things are supposed to be. The giant mechs that the Federation use are scaled to be regular people height, and when you start meeting regular looking space pirates on later in the game, you get told that they're as powerful as the Omega Pirate, even though they don't look or act like it one bit. This whole chibi thing makes trying to follow the progression of the game confusing since scale doesn't seem to be consistent on either the player characters or the enemies you're fighting. Federation Force's attempt to be a true Prime game was laughable at the time of its hype trailers, and when it came out it was even more so. Even though the chibi aesthetic and the new art style doesn't add much and it's not charming to say the least, the locations you do go to do feel like Prime locations. It's just that since this game has zero Metroidvania elements and that removes the entire exploration aspect from being a part of this game, the backdrops by themselves have to be super interesting to compensate, and they are absolutely not. They are good Metroid locations, but without lore building or set pieces or cutscenes to build them up in a good campaign, they all end up as forgettable locations that only exist because the gameplay needs them instead of being interesting worlds we could get lost in, and also due to the mission-based nature of the game, there's also no reason to get immersed in the world since the arenas you go to do your mission are all different from each other and have no context to tell you how they connect. So there's just zero world building in this game, since the game just ends up being a series of disconnected maps and no rhyme or reason to any of it outside of the one mission that they're used for. The boss battles are also universally lackluster due to the non-charming new chibi art style that reduces detail across the board and doesn't have an interesting art style to replace it with. Plus the beasties are built to be generic, such as fighting the Ice Titan, the giant mechanical sphere Kryphon, or just another sea monster on a small boat. There is no Thardus, Ridley, Kraid, or any interesting new monsters. It's just shit like the Ice Titan, which looks like a slight upgrade to a regular Prime enemy, since that's how bad it is. Hell, there's only one mission in this game that even focuses on the Metroids, just to underline how much Federation Force does not care to exist in the Metroid universe. That was obvious when the whole story can be boiled down to the bad guys are making a big gun. But it's nice to see those confirmations of its own shittiness. Customizing your character is also shallow and borderline useless since you get a couple of parts on your mech that you can paint and possibly change up your pilot as well. You get to name your squad, but all told, it's like 5 choices to make, and this game even has amiibo functionality for some cosmic reason that I'm sure 6 players out there made good use of. Your biggest choice is that you can pick from something like 12 to 20 modules to put in your mech depending on the mission you're going on, since your objectives are starkly varied. But as per usual bad game tradition, it's more like you'll get a build of 3 of them that you can rely on for most things and throw the rest into the corner to rot forever, since the modules don't contain interesting abilities. It's more like artillery attacks such as missiles and increased defense or speed, stat boosting items instead of cool slick new movement tech or unique attack barrages to make them a core part of the gameplay, rather than just increasing a number by 20% or whatever the hell they actually did. I mean, the game is so usually easy and the combat's so simplistic that none of the customization stuff is actually necessary. But that's not to say that this game is a cakewalk. There are like 5 missions that'll enjoy shoving your face into the game over screen multiple times, because they're either insanely slow, badly designed, or will deal you out huge punishments for slight mistakes, which is aggravating to the nth degree due to no mid-mission checkpoints. You fail at the end, you run the whole gauntlet again. I would imagine Federation Force had a lot of player count fall off throughout the campaign due to missions like the Minecart Escort, which could have a run take 20 minutes, totally due to the insane slowness and small margin for error on protecting it from the elements on such a ridiculously long track to the ship. It's a mission that's so terrible that it amazes me that the creators wanted it put on the center stage as a campaign requirement. Again, there are around 5 missions that have portions like this that actively ruin your progression for unjustifiable reasons. Samus is involved in Federation Force, but in an incredibly vague fashion where you'll occasionally get intel reports from her to inform your next mission of blowing up shield generators or missile factories, but it's all done off screen and on text boxes, so it barely counts as her being part of the story, because seeing how Samus acquires this intel and information would just be too interesting for a game like Federation Force, so they quickly gloss over all of that unimportant story to focus on a man who has a helmet for a face shooting space spiders on all planets. Samus does make an appearance kind of at the final mission where the aliens leading the space pirates to build the Doomsday weapon kidnap Samus and brainwash her to be the game's final battle, which is weirdly easy considering the other bullshit parts of the game. And then she manages to recover and save your dopey ass just before the weapon explodes and kills you. I really don't know what Nintendo was thinking when they made a game like this. It feels like a title that should have been focused more on its multiplayer online stuff, but there's a decent chance that none of that sort of thing is in Federation Force, and if it's not, then I have no explanation for why this game is being this badly crafted. Rather than being a game true to the Prime nature where you explore, learn about a planet and its problems, and shoot all the bad guys causing those issues in the face, the game instead wants to focus on the player creating a character that they can take from their subpar campaign stuff as pseudo-training to go online and have fun with their friends. That's what all the customization stuff is there for, is for the players to create accounts they can attach themselves to in order to develop that account over their multiple game modes like any other online game. The campaign is laughably bad, and a pretty big misfire due to the lackluster objectives and complete failure to craft a world that players would be interested in fighting for. There is no scanning, no Metroidvania elements, and no lore to get invested in. All they did was make a bunch of places for you to shoot aliens in, nothing more and nothing less. It's a game you pick up once and immediately put down, since that's all the effort the developers put into crafting a game story. It's an obligation for the game at best, which is unacceptable for a game flying the Prime flag. If you are feeling particularly uncharitable, you could call this game a slap in the face of fans, but to be fair, the game functions as well as it needs to be, and while it's a boring-ass slog, at least it functions, so at the end of the day, the game's not actually badly made. It was just built to be as boring as possible, and that's its greatest sin. It's too dull to give a shit about its existence. Kind of like how Triforce Heroes ended up. And also considering that 3D Land exists, maybe Nintendo just did this to all of their major series on the 3DS. And now we come to the final stop on the train as of the time of writing, Dread. A foreboding title that promised haughty things for their next major game release in the franchise. Unexpectedly, Nintendo alluded to creating a game that was going to follow in the footsteps of Fusion and try to take a second crack at making a horror-tinged Metroid game. At the time of trailers, this was an exciting prospect. Nintendo back in 2003 were so close to making a legit horror sci-fi game in Metroid Fusion that taking a second crack at it might finally get us the full potential of what Fusion was going for. I'm sure I wasn't the only one excited for Metroid coming to the Switch and being creepy about it. However, I smelled a rat once I saw the first reveal of the robot enemies that would be major in the game. These robots were intricate and agile death machines that track Samus down to destroy with prejudice. The problem was that the design of the robot for a game calling itself Dread was pretty bad, because the robot enemies were not scary. They completely lacked a horror design. The robots act scary and they're aggressive and dangerous, but for a horror game, they need to look the part, otherwise the ambience suffers. And as I got through the early parts of the game, unfortunately this would remain consistent. Dread follows more in line with the Metroid 2 remake than what Fusion did, and any idea about Dread being the true horror sci-fi game from Nintendo that the name Dread would imply was thrown right out of the fucking window. There is no sax, there is no interesting nightmare gameplay section, hell there's not even a foreboding final boss. For this game, our ultimate antagonist is Ravenbeak, a character that was established quite a long time ago in some lost flavor text or the Metroid manga as a major threat in previous events, but never seen in a major game role until now. And likewise, Ravenbeak is not a scary character to the point that after the intro fight we have with him, I thought that Ravenbeak was going to be one of the members of the Rogues Gallery, and there was going to be a bigger villain behind him pulling the strings. I thought he would be Dread's Kraid instead of Dread's mother brain. I'll say now that Dread's dropping of the horror ball was disappointing after fending off the game's second major robot murderer, but that's not to say that Dread is a lackluster Metroid game, quite the opposite. Like Other M, Dread is also showcasing a lot of the nostalgic elements of previous games and bringing back the Metroids alongside the X-Parasites as enemies in this game, but also giving us a crazy number of power-ups to dig up in this game. Power Bomb, Grapple Beam, Speed Booster, Ice Missile, Wave and Diffusion Beam, and Double Jump and Screw Attack. This game is bringing it all to the table, along with some quality of life improvements throughout the game's Aeon abilities. Brought back from the return of Samus, Samus requires another handful of special weapons which allow her to slow down time and instantly teleport short distances. One of these abilities is the one that serves as a 360 radar to detect breakable blocks, plus the addition of a great auto map and more teleporter options to get you between many collectibles compared to Prime, but still a high number to challenge your Metroidvania skills. Plus, while the maps aren't as beautiful as Prime due to the lack of the ability to directly interact with it, they are unique maps, they are interesting backgrounds, and Mercury's team put in a lot of effort and detail into their map of ZDR. From an outsider, Dread is some fine work, and most of their redesigns are integrated well to pre-established Metroid stuff. They did get their chance to show off with their boss gallery of Dread, which is always a necessity for Metroidvanias. Unlike the power-ups, there's not much for nostalgic hits in Dread's bosses, with the only direct callback being Kraid early on, which is great. Mercury's team brought him back exactly as he needed to be. A giant imposing lizard guy stuck to the side of a cave. The rest are unique creations, but the issue is that while they are detailed and interesting monsters, they aren't going to end up being fan favorites like Ridley or Phantoon, since they don't have the gimmicks behind them of being intelligent, conniving, or cool creatures. It's just a series of giant monsters that seem barely sentient. One's a giant lizard, a giant bug, a giant plant, and whatever the hell the experimental beast was. While their bosses aren't all that memorable in the grand scheme of things, they did great work on their encounters, which is more important. The beasts are aggressive, fast, and dangerous, with totally different patterns, attacks, and weaknesses to exploit. The addition of Metroid's faster combat by mixing in the melee counters and dodging of the modern games serve Mercury's team's bosses incredibly well, since you can take advantage of quicker, riskier moves to show off a challenging and rewarding combat model. The whole tough but fair thing. Plus, when the game knows to be dramatic with Ravenbeak's final boss, it does that well too, since they do some dramatic cutscenes when they reveal that Ravenbeak is going to be a multiple phase fight. For a guy with boring motivations and getting his only full appearance in Dread, Mercury's team does a lot of work to make him an intriguing antagonist. They could have done a lot more to make him stand out as the big bad dude holding all the cards, but he's still a solid villain for what we've got for a typical I just want to kill all of the things villain. The progression for Dread is pretty damn good, not as linear as Fusion, but linear enough to indirectly push the player to where they need to go. They do bring back the Adam check-ins from Fusion, but not as much as in that game since Adam isn't supposed to be the villainous force in this game, so it's more straightforward this time. He gives us the information we need to get off this rock while blowing the X-Parasites to Kingdom Come. The objectives are clear, and with easy-to-use block radar, getting around this map isn't a slog at all. It's a good journey all around with the backtracking stuck down to a minimum, and even if you do have to head back to 2 levels ago, there are more elevators to find that helps cut down on your commute. You get some really good movement tech. The double and infinite jumping are more intuitive to use since the other games required you to jump on a rhythm, plus ledge climbing and spider balling to get around just makes for a real pleasant journey. Quick and cool looking platforming, this game has it all. It's the surprising talent that Mercury's team has after playing the Lord of Shadows trilogy. They just have this uncanny ability to be the best rip-off artists, where they're handed the license to work with previously established IPs, and then spin them around and remix them into something that references the old stuff, but in completely new ways. It's an odd knack that no other studio has been able to nail down, and it's shown off beautifully in their Metroid games. However, a big sticking point for Dread are the major antagonists in the Emmys. The machines that the Federation sent to this planet to track down the X-Parasites, built specifically as aggressive machines and the only thing that can take on these threats to the universe. But they ended up being reprogrammed by Ravenbeak to serve as collectors for Samus's DNA, since he wants to acquire that data so that he can command the Metroids to conquer the galaxy. The problem is that all Emmy encounters are the same, doing stealth to work around them to get to a generator and acquire a one-time power to fry their CPUs in one shot. The issue with these sections is that it's just bad stealth. It's incredibly punishing for making mistakes, and mistakes also being easy to make due to limited options and the enemies having too many opportunities to sniff out Samus and bad patrol patterns that don't give you options to get out of corners. The stealth system puts way too much weight in the enemy's favor, which is weird since these sections were clearly one of the features that was worked on the most. It has the most AI, the most programming put in, but it seems like they weren't able to find a workable balance towards making a fair challenge. With another huge problem being that in these sections, the enemies are designed to be so agile and so adaptable that you can't even find a hiding place, because no matter how small it is, the enemies can get into any hole in any of their sections. And their sections are really big, they take up big portions of the map. The bottom line to this is that, like all bad stealth sections, the punishment for getting caught is immediate failure. You do get an opportunity to melee counter the enemy in order to get away, but one, the timing for the melee counter is so brief and so impossible that once you get found by the enemy, there's like a 5% chance that you can get out of it on a casual play, and two, even if you do get away, the stun on the enemy is so brief that it's easy for the enemy to immediately track you down and grab you again. Plus, the entire stealth section was just a bad idea for a game attempting to put in horror elements. Surprisingly, it's bad for the horror ambience to have the monster kill the player and kill them multiple times, since it destroys the fear of the monster and replaces it with annoyance, which is the opposite emotion you want to convey in any sort of horror atmosphere. That's the ultimate screw up here. Making it so easy for the enemy to get kills ruins any sort of horror angle they were going for, even if they already did that by making the enemy's designs not scary. Hell, even a glitchy, fucked up moving robot would have been a better idea if you wanted to keep the same design. Maybe like the FNAF animatronics with exposed gears or machinery, like literally anything to make these robots scary, because right now, they look like Apple products. Another problem is that once you do get powered up to kill an enemy, it's far from a guaranteed hit. You get one shot on an enemy, and you have to put yourself in a position where the enemy finds you and is walking right up to Samus. Then you have to charge the shot while it's walking up to you and hit it dead in the face. Otherwise, it fails, and you're probably getting caught and failing the section. To be fair, once you do fail, you are put immediately in another attempt, since this game has modern checkpoints instead of booting you back to a save point, so all in all, the enemy sections are the antithesis of horror. Immediate kill features and no punishment for screwing it up, along with an imperceptible change to their AI once you fail to do dynamic difficulty. They're always doing this smart and aggressive, and surprisingly, even though Samus has the ability to turn invisible, it doesn't help much against them because they are so fucking fast. And they camp where you're invisible, so it doesn't even matter since you're gonna fucking run out of invisibility before the enemy goes somewhere else and then it just finds you anyway. At least Nintendo's trailer of the Emmy was representative of the product, unfortunately. While the Ravenbeak battle is great in spite of Ravenbeak being an underwhelming villain, something interesting does happen during the end game. After a grueling battle, Samus manages to awaken a deep-seated Metroid ability that allows her to directly steal the power from her downed enemies around the time that the last enemy has been demolished. This causes a story beat to come about where Samus's Metroid parts of her body might make her a danger to the rest of the galaxy if it manages to consume her moral compass. The problem being that it's too late in the game to matter and it isn't integrated into the larger plot as a major thread. But it's an interesting story beat, plus it leads us to getting the best looking suit in the franchise. The Metroid suit that Samus puts on through absorbing too much energy with her ability turns her into this freakish body horror looking suit thing that's covered in spikes. The Metroid suit is such a cool concept and one of the best designs that it's such a shame that it only lasts like 5 minutes in the game because damn, everything about it is just perfect. And again, it's a shame that Samus's Metroidness serves as more of a Dread side story rather than the big plot driver for this game, especially since hyping up the danger she poses to the rest of the universe is simply a ruse by Ravenbeak to throw Samus off balance. The thing that worked out even less was Ravenbeak revealing to Samus that some of her partial Chozo DNA was originally crafted from Ravenbeak himself, so he says that he's technically her father, which goes literally nowhere. While the plot has some speed bumps, and I didn't even mention Quiet Robe because he doesn't factor into the story at all, much beyond giving Samus access and hints to move forward on her quest before getting killed, it was interesting and cool to see living Chozo in the Metroid universe before, they all got killed again. Dread has an incredibly feature-complete Metroidvania journey for you to take, some hard-hitting bosses and slick, well-used power-ups from the previous games, along with a few new ones for Dread specifically. I can definitely see why Dread is a lot of people's new favorites of the Metroid series, even though I think that it has some noticeable faults throughout the runtime. I don't think that Prime's contemplative nature and ingenuity is going to be surpassed anytime soon. Metroid Prime was a lightning in a bottle, and while Dread is a remarkably good game, it's definitely not the best of the Metroids. I do hope that Mercury's theme stays on the Metroid brand for a couple more games, since between this and Return of Samus, they clearly have ideas and the ability to revolutionize how we see Metroid games, and if they set their mind to it, there is a slight chance we could get an Aliens or Event Horizon flavored Metroid game, since science fiction and horror always work well together and we were never able to get a full horror Metroid experience. Our closest to that still being Fusion's weird development. So yeah, I'd say keep it coming, boys. You have that goddamn knack to learn a series you've never worked before and fucking just put tons of new spins on it. I love seeing this. While Metroid isn't as historic as the Zelda series due to it having slightly less of a profile and Nintendo dropping it for years at a time due to lack of ideas, such as the N64 example in the Prime section for what we got, it is clear why Samus remains one of Nintendo's important mascots and recurring characters. Samus is an interesting person from a sci-fi world that has only been seen a few times. Female badass raised by aliens that ends up saving the galaxy with a gun arm is pretty unique in the terms of media. Plus, the fact that Metroid's original design flipped the world of platforming on its head provided the world with a gameplay model that is fueling a lot of indie projects to this day already shows its mark on the gaming landscape, even though Castlevania probably provided more of a roadmap towards what people think of Metroidvania than what Metroid did. Metroid is a Nintendo vehicle. Nintendo tends to not give the time of day to narrative-driven games, so that's where Castlevania was able to pull up the slack and produce some really juicy Metroidvania worlds. Castlevania was produced a lot more by Konami, and therefore overall quality isn't there all the time. The weird thing is that Metroid was able to hold its quality a lot more for a series spanning so many years. Not as many franchises can boast about having such solid standards as Metroid, except for maybe Kirby. It's a series that was willing to reinvent itself, a series that had its best days with a team of American nobodies that had little expectations when they broke the mold on the Metroid series in 2002. And that's not to forget that Super Metroid that managed to be the Super Mario World of Metroid games, slickly transferring over the ideas of Metroid to the 16-bit days and producing the flagship of iconography the series will be flying up until the modern day. If Other M had been as good as its potential would have allowed, this would have been a series of gold standards rather than a mixed bag, unfortunately. Metroid has had some bad years. The back-to-back of Other M and Federation Force was an unfortunate situation, but we also got Return of Samus and Dread back-to-back, so maybe things are looking up. Maybe they do have a new direction of where they want to go with this. There is still stuff to do in the Federation Galaxy, and whether or not it's going to be a story-focused journey on a weird planet or another straightforward collect the things to shoot the guys to save the universe from Metroids, I'm sure whatever is going to be in store for Samus is going to be at the very least interesting to watch. Metroid has defined itself with quirky power-ups, great map design, and fun bosses, and with the introduction of more intricate combat and quality-of-life mechanics being added to our well-trodden Metroidvania ideals, the stage is set for some of our best Metroid games to be produced. I'm still holding out hope for a legitimately creepy Metroid game, the whole game, to one day come about and fill in Fusion's shoes. But I'd be happy with another straightforward game like Return of Samus, because this is a series that has high hopes, and Nintendo did right the ship with the right teams after their dual failures in the early 2010s. Like any sort of fictional space show, we'll just have to see what's beyond our infinite horizon and go where no bounty hunter has gone before. Thank y'all for watching another franchise review, and I will catch you around next time for whatever next series I'm going to be pulling out of my ass.